Chapter 1: The Return to End House. End and House had stood at the edge of the cliff for over a century, its tall, weather-beaten silhouette etched against the sky. It had witnessed the passage of time, untouched by the bustling world below. To most, it was just a relic of the past, a place where dark secrets rested, forgotten by the town below. But to those who had lived there, it was much more than that. It was a prison of memories, a haunted legacy of a family that had once ruled the town of Silvermere. The new owner of End House, Richard Graham, had only recently returned from his years abroad. After inheriting the mansion from an estranged relative he barely remembered, Richard had come to Silvermere with plans to sell the house and its property. But the moment his car had rolled past the wrought iron gates, something had pulled him inside. Perhaps it was the heavy weight of his family's past that called him back. Or perhaps it was the eerie whispers that seemed to float on the wind. Richard had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. But standing in front of End House, he felt an inexplicable chill creep down his spine. There was something about this house, about the land it sat upon, that felt wrong. As Richard entered the house for the first time since his childhood, the door creaked as though it hadn't been opened in years. He glanced around, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the foyer. The house was exactly as he remembered, full of dust, dark corners, and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the sun. But there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the echo of footsteps, trailing him from room to room. Richard shook his head, attributing the sensation to his nerves. He had lived a life free of fear, focused on business and career. What could this old house hold? Surely it was just his imagination playing tricks. Chapter 2: The First Visitor. The next morning, as Richard examined the papers left behind by his late relative, a knock echoed through the silent halls of End House. He opened the door to find a woman standing on the threshold, tall, elegant, with an air of quiet authority. She wore a long, dark coat that billowed in the cold breeze, her eyes hidden behind a pair of round spectacles. "I'm Clara Ashford," she introduced herself, her voice soft yet firm. "I've come to speak with you about the house." Richard stared at her, not entirely sure what to make of her sudden appearance. "You're a local?" Clara nodded. "I've been researching your family's history. I know what happened here many years ago, the tragedy that has haunted this house. It's not just a memory, it's a curse." Richard's brow furrowed, a flicker of unease rising in him. "A curse? What are you talking about?" Clara's gaze never left his as she stepped inside. "There are things about this house that you don't know. Things that go beyond your inheritance." Richard could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What do you mean? Are you saying my family's past is somehow connected to this place?" Clara paused for a moment, then spoke softly, almost as though the walls themselves might hear. "Your family's name is entwined with a legacy of blood and loss. The house was built upon a tragedy, a betrayal that still lingers in the air. I've seen it before. It draws people in, luring them with promises of wealth and inheritance, and then it claims them." Richard stared at her, a shiver crawling up his spine. I don't believe in superstitions or ghost stories. Clara's eyes locked onto his with a chilling intensity. Then you haven't been listening to the house. It speaks in whispers, and it's been waiting for you. Chapter 3. The Secrets Beneath the Floorboards. Later that evening, Richard sat alone in the drawing room, the fire casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. He tried to ignore the words Clara had said, focusing instead on the papers and ledgers scattered across the table. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept wandering back to her cryptic warnings. Suddenly, there was a soft sound, a scraping noise, as if something was being dragged across the floor. Richard looked up, his heart skipping a beat. The room was empty, save for the furniture and the pile of papers in front of him. Another noise. This time, more distinct. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the old fireplace. Richard hesitated. He knew he should go check, but a part of him, a part that had been lulled into a sense of calm by the house's eerie stillness, wanted to pretend he hadn't heard it, that he was simply imagining things. But then, the scraping came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. His pulse quickened as he stood up, pushing the chair back. Slowly, he made his way to the fireplace. The noise grew louder, and as he reached the corner, he noticed something strange. A section of the floor near the hearth was slightly raised, as though the wood had been disturbed. Without thinking, Richard knelt down and pried at the wooden panel. It came loose with a creak, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath. The scraping had stopped. Inside the hidden space was an old wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. His hands shook slightly as he reached for it, pulling it out into the open. The chest felt heavier than it should have, its iron hinges rusted with age. With a deep breath, Richard opened the chest. Inside was a collection of old letters, yellowed with age, their ink faded and barely legible. But beneath the letters, something else caught his eye, a small, intricately carved box. The box was sealed with a heavy iron lock, and something about it felt wrong. His fingers hovered over it, and for a moment he hesitated. He knew he shouldn't open it. He felt it in his gut. But curiosity gnawed at him. What had Clara been talking about? What had his family left behind in this house? Richard lifted the box from the chest, and as he touched the lock, a cold draft swept through the room. The air grew thick, and a whisper, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the walls. It's time, Richard. Section 4. The echo of the past. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the box. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The very air around him thick with the sound of a voice he could not place. His pulse raced. "Who's there?" he demanded, but the only response was the faint whisper of the wind outside. He quickly locked the box again, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. That's when he saw it, a small plaque inside the chest, partially hidden beneath the letters. It was a name, carved into the wood. Evelyn Graham. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Evelyn Graham? His great-grandmother? But what was this box doing here, hidden away in the very place where his ancestors had once lived? Clara's warning echoed in his mind. The house had been built upon a legacy of betrayal and blood. Richard stood up, clutching the box to his chest. The chilling realization hit him all at once. The house was waiting for him, and there were things here, in the walls, in the air, things that wanted to stay hidden. The truth about his family, about the house, was buried beneath the floorboards, waiting to be uncovered. And as the shadows stretched long into the night, Richard knew that whatever secret lay within that box would change everything. Chapter 5: The Unraveling of the Past. Section 1: The Legacy of Blood. Richard sat in the dimly lit study, the small faucet resting on the table before him. The weight of it felt heavier than he had expected, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. His mind raced with the implications of the name he had discovered: Evelyn Graham, the name of his great-grandmother, the very same family line that had once owned End House. Why was this box hidden? Why was it so important? The questions gnawed at him, keeping him rooted to the spot, unable to move. The letters scattered across the table remained untouched, their secrets waiting to be uncovered. But it was the box that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, calling to him. He could feel it in his bones. He glanced at the letters once more, but it was the plaque inside the chest that haunted him. Evelyn Graham. His great-grandmother had been an enigmatic figure in his family's history, shrouded in mystery. The old tales his parents had told him of a woman who had vanished without a trace echoed in his mind. Richard knew he had to open the box, but something inside him recoiled at the thought. Before he could gather his courage, a knock echoed from the front door, shattering the tense silence. Section 2: Clara's Warning. Richard stood up quickly, brushing dust off his trousers as he moved toward the door. He wasn't sure if he was more relieved or frustrated by the interruption. He opened the door to find Clara standing there, her face pale and serious. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the dark hallway behind her. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with concern. He stepped aside to let her in. As she entered, Clara took a deep breath, as though weighing her words carefully. "You've been too quiet, Richard. I know you've been looking into things, into your family's past. But there's something you need to understand. Something I didn't tell you before." Richard's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Clara paused, then spoke carefully. "I've been researching more than just the history of this house. I've looked into your great-grandmother, Evelyn Graham. And what I've found, it's not just about a tragic family secret. It's about the house itself, the land it's built on. There's something here, something darker than just a buried legacy." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" Clara's eyes met his, her voice trembling slightly. "The house is alive. Richard, it's more than just walls and bricks. It feeds on the bloodline that lives here. It has always been tied to your family. It was built on a foundation of death." Richard frowned, his mind racing. "What do you mean by that? What does this have to do with Evelyn?" "I'm not sure yet. But Evelyn was part of something, a ritual, a covenant, something that's been passed down through generations. That box you found, it's a key. But it's not just a key to unlocking the past. It's a key to something else." Richard stepped back, his hand instinctively going to the box, still resting on the table. He hadn't opened it yet. but his unease had grown tenfold. "What are you saying?" "Clara," he repeated, his voice strained. What exactly was Evelyn involved in? Clara took a deep breath, her eyes steady. "Your great-grandmother made a pact." "Richard." "She sold the souls of her descendants to the house to keep the power of in-house alive." Section 3. The Dark Pact. Clara's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard could hardly process them. The room spinning as the reality of what she had just revealed settled in. "Are you telling me that Evelyn, my great-grandmother, sold our family's souls?" Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded solemnly. "Not just your family's souls, but the souls of anyone who lived in this house." The house was built on the foundation of an ancient curse, and every generation of Grahams has been bound to it. Each one has made the same choice, whether knowingly or not. The house requires a payment in exchange for its power, its protection. Richard felt the room close in around him, his breathing shallow. This is madness. "What do you mean?" "Protection. The house has always felt wrong. But I never thought it was because of this. I thought it was just a place steeped in bad memories." Clara's gaze softened. "That's what the house wants you to believe. It's so good at hiding itself, at drawing you in with its charm. But it doesn't just prey on your family. It feeds on anyone it can. And it's been doing it for generations." Richard stepped toward the table, his fingers hovering over the small box. He could feel its presence, a dark weight that had never truly left the house. He knew that opening it wouldn't just reveal the past, it would reveal the future. Clara walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Richard, the house has already begun to claim you. You can feel it, can't you? The whispers, the pull, it's all connected. The box is a trap, a way to bring you into the fold completely. But you have a choice now." Richard's heart raced. What choice? "You can burn the house down, destroy the curse once and for all. Or you can open the box and let it consume you. Let it claim you as it has claimed so many before." Voss stared at Clara, his mind racing. "And if I open the box," Clara's face darkened, "the house will have you, for good. Your soul will be bound to it, just as your ancestors were." The weight of her words hit him with full force, and for the first time since entering End House, Richard felt a flicker of true terror. Section 4. The Choice. Richard's hand hovered over the box, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. He had come to End House with a goal to sell it, to be done with it. But now, the house seemed to be pulling him into a deeper game, one where the stakes were his very soul. The whispers in the walls were louder now, like a soft hum in the back of his mind. He could hear them more clearly, words that made no sense but felt deeply familiar. The choice seemed impossible, but it was clear to him now that there was no easy path forward. Either destroy the house and everything it had created, or succumb to its power, forever bound to the land that had held generations of suffering. Clara's presence beside him offered a sense of grounding, but even she seemed to recognize the gravity of what they were facing. "I don't know if I can do this," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to do it alone," Clara replied. her hand gently squeezing his arm. "We'll figure it out. Together." Richard's gaze shifted to the box again, the symbol of his family's tragic legacy staring back at him. And as he opened it, the room around him seemed to go silent, the air growing thick with tension. The box was empty, or so it seemed at first. But as Richard's eyes adjusted to the darkened space, a single, ancient key lay inside. "This is it," Richard said, his voice trembling. "This is the key to ending everything." Clara stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. The key to what? Before Richard could answer, a low, menacing sound began to rise from deep within the house, as if the very foundation of End House was awakening. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 6, The Awakening of the House, Section 1. The Key. The key lay heavy in Richard's palm, a small but unmistakable object, cold to the touch, yet pulsing with an eerie energy. As he stared at it, he could almost feel the house itself responding, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. Clara stood beside him, her hand still on his arm, but the unease was evident in her eyes. "What is it? What does it open?" Richard looked at the key, his fingers tightening around it. "I don't know, but it's the final piece of the puzzle. This key, it's connected to something deeper within the house." The whispers grew louder, more distinct now, as if they were coming from every corner of the room. The walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, the floorboards creaking under an unseen weight. The house was alive, and it was waking up. "I think we need to find out what it opens," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "But Richard, we have to be careful. If this is what I think it is, if this is what I fear it is." Richard nodded, his eyes steely with determination. "I don't have much choice. The house has already claimed my family. It's time I ended this once and for all." Section 2. Into the heart of the house together. They walked through the long, silent hallways of End House. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, the house breathing with a strange rhythm. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very walls were pressing in on them. The house was a labyrinth of corridors, rooms that seemed to go on forever, and doors that led to forgotten spaces. But the key in Richard's hand seemed to guide him, drawing him forward like a magnet. Finally, they reached the cellar. The old iron door stood before them, its surface rusted and scarred with age. The door had always been locked, the one part of the house that Richard had never dared to explore as a child. His great-grandmother had always warned him to stay away from it. But now, with the key in his hand, he understood why. "This is it," Richard whispered, the weight of his words sinking into the stillness of the house. Clara looked at him, her face pale. "Are you sure?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His fingers hovered over the lock, hesitating for just a moment. He had no idea what waited behind this door, no idea what would happen if he unlocked it. But he couldn't turn back now. With a deep breath, he inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed throughout the house, like a death knell. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a staircase that descended into pitch darkness. A cold, damp air seeped up from below, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else. Something musty, ancient, Voss felt the tension in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Section 3. The Heart of the Curse. Richard and Clara made their way down the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled on the old stone floor. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and Richard's breath became visible in the dim light of the candle. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large circular chamber. The stone walls were covered with strange symbols, etched deep into the rock, and the floor was a mosaic of ancient runes, worn by time. In the center of the room was an altar. The stone surface was cracked, and strange markings had been carved into its surface, ones that matched the symbols on the walls. The altar seemed to pulsate with an energy that was almost palpable, as if something or someone was waiting. "This is it," Clara whispered, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "This is where it all began." Richard stepped forward, his heart racing. The key, still warm from his grip, seemed to hum in his hand. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't know what would happen next. With a deep breath, he placed the key into a hidden slot in the altar. A low rumble shook the floor beneath them, and the room seemed to groan as if waking from a long, deep sleep. The walls trembled, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. And then the altar cracked open. From within, a soft light began to glow, casting long shadows across the room. As the light grew brighter, a figure began to take shape, a tall, cloaked figure with glowing eyes, its features obscured by the shadows of the hood. Clara gasped, stepping back. "What is that? Who is that?" The figure didn't speak, but Richard could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for centuries to emerge. "I am the keeper." The figure finally spoke, its voice echoing through the chamber. "The house has been my prison for as long as it has stood. You, Richard Graham, are the last of your bloodline. And now, the house is yours." Richard's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" The keeper stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on Richard. "You have unlocked the house's true power. The Graham family's blood has always been bound to this place, and now you have the choice." "Choice?" Richard echoed, his voice shaky. "What kind of choice?" The keeper's voice became colder. "You can take the power for yourself, become the master of End House, as your ancestors once were. Or you can destroy it, break the curse that has been placed upon your family. But in doing so, you will destroy yourself." Clara stepped forward, her eyes filled with terror. "Don't listen to it, Richard. You can't take that power. It's not worth it." The keeper's gaze shifted to Clara, its eyes narrowing. "You, too, have felt the house's pull. You cannot escape it. It will consume you, just as it consumes all who enter." Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. The choice was unbearable. The power to control the house, to rule it. It was tempting, but at what cost? "Please," Clara whispered, "don't make the same mistake they did. Don't let the house take you." Richard's mind swirled with uncertainty. Could he control it? Could he destroy it without losing everything? The weight of his ancestors' choices hung on him. "Fine. Section 4. The Decision. The keeper's voice grew louder, more insistent. Make your choice. Richard, time is running out. Richard's hand tightened around the key, feeling the heat of the decision pressing against him. He could feel the power of the house coursing through his veins, tempting him, calling him. But then, Clara's words echoed in his mind. Don't let it consume you. The choice was clear. Richard slammed the key back into the altar, sealing the chamber with a resounding thud. The keeper let out a scream, a noise that reverberated throughout the walls of the house. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the house groaned as though in agony. In that moment, Richard knew what had to be done. The house had lived off the suffering of his ancestors, and now it would suffer for its centuries of control with one final, defiant act. Richard destroyed the altar, severing the connection between the house and the dark force that had ruled it for so long. Epilogue: the silent echo. The house fell silent. The whispers stopped. The walls ceased to breathe. As Richard and Clara made their way back up the stairs, the house seemed to have lost its power. The weight that had pressed on them for so long now lifted. They stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth of the world outside. The house was no longer a prison, no longer a place of dark legacy. It had been freed, and so had they. But as they looked back at End House, standing still at the edge of the cliff, Richard couldn't help but feel that something was still waiting. The echoes of the past might have been silenced, but the future was uncertain. One thing was clear, however: the cycle had been broken. And for the first time in his life, Richard Graham was free. Chapter 7. The Last Whisper. Section 1. The Unseen Hand. It had been months since Richard and Clara had destroyed the altar beneath End House. The mansion now stood in quiet isolation, seemingly abandoned, yet it was no longer the same haunted place. The weight that had clung to it, the oppressive darkness that had suffocated Richard's every step, was gone. The house, for the first time in a century, felt empty, free. Richard had sold the house, and with it, the last ties to his family's cursed past. He had moved on, as had Clara, and the town of Silvermere had resumed its slow, steady rhythm. But there were still nights when Richard would wake in a cold sweat, the shadows of his dreams shifting just beyond the edges of his consciousness. He had made his choice, but it had not been without consequence. As he sat in the quiet of his new apartment in the city, he reflected on everything that had transpired. The destruction of End House, the fall of its curse, had freed him from the chains of his family's legacy. Yet, there was an unsettling feeling, like an echo that had been left behind, waiting to resurface. It was one evening, as Richard was reviewing his notes on the house's history, when he received an unexpected visit. Clara knocked softly on his door. "Richard," she said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Her voice was serious, more than usual. "I think I've found something. Something I didn't want to admit." Richard looked up, startled by the urgency in her tone. "What is it?" Clara's eyes met his, and for a moment there was hesitation. "The house may be gone, but its influence hasn't fully disappeared." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Clara took a deep breath. glancing at the papers on the table. I've been investigating the history of End House further. I've found something unsettling. Richard felt his stomach drop. What have you found? Clara stepped forward, laying a file on the table. When we destroyed the altar, we severed the immediate connection to the curse. But what we didn't account for was the legacy that End House leaves behind. There are still ripples. The house's power doesn't end just because the walls fell silent. It lingers, like an aftershock. And Richard stood up, his heart pounding. Clara, what do you mean by aftershock? Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. I believe there's something more. A force that wasn't just tied to the house itself. Something older. Something far older. Section 2. The Legacy of the House. The file Clara had brought was thick with handwritten notes, ancient symbols, and references to forgotten rituals that no one had thought to document. But I've been researching the house's true origins, Clara explained, her tone grim. We thought it was just a cursed house, built on the bones of something tragic. But it wasn't just that. The land itself. Richard, it's tied to something much older. A kind of power that predates anything your family ever did. Richard flipped through the pages, feeling his grip on reality slip further with each new discovery. This house was built on an old burial ground, not just any ground, but a site of a forgotten cult that predated even the oldest known civilizations. These people believed in something ancient, an entity, or perhaps a force, that they worshipped as a deity. The house itself was constructed as an offering not to shelter, but to contain that power. The curse wasn't just something attached to your family. It was always there. Richard's head spun. Are you telling me that the house was never just a house, that it was a prison for something else? Something ancient. Clara nodded slowly. The power wasn't tied to the house. Richard, it was tied to the land, to the sacrifice that had been made in the past. Your great-grandmother, Evelyn Graham, was a part of that sacrifice. The key you found. It was not just a family heirloom. It was part of a seal that kept that ancient force locked beneath the house. Richard stepped back, as if the floor had suddenly fallen out beneath him. So, when we destroyed the house, we didn't just break the curse. We broke the seal. Clara's silence was answer enough. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Richard's arm. We broke the seal. Richard, the house is no longer there to contain it. Section 3. The Awakening Force. The feeling of dread grew stronger by the day. The very air around Richard seemed to thicken with a sense of impending doom. For the first time, he began to question whether their victory at End House had truly been that a victory. I've been tracking strange occurrences across the town. Clara continued. Unexplainable events. People reporting whispers, visions, and disappearances. It's all linked back to the site of End House. But it's not just the house itself. It's something more powerful that's been unleashed. Richard clenched his fists, a surge of adrenaline rushing through him. What is it? Clara, what have we let out? Clara hesitated. I think it's an ancient entity, a being that existed before recorded history, tied to the land itself. The people who lived there before were merely its servants, drawing power from it. When the house was built, It wasn't just a family's home. It was a prison. Richard could feel the weight of her words in his chest. His great-grandmother, Evelyn, had been part of this twisted legacy, but he had thought it ended with the destruction of the house. Now, he realized it was only just beginning. "I need to go back," Richard said, his voice firm. "I need to face what we unleashed." Clara grabbed his arm, urgency in her eyes. "You can't go back there. The house is gone, but the land is still. Cursed, whatever it is, it's growing stronger. It's pulling people in." "We don't have a choice," Richard replied, his mind made up. "If it's already begun to spread, then we have to stop it before it consumes everything." Section 4. The Return to End House. Against Clara's protests, Richard made his way back to Silvermere. The town seemed different somehow, quieter, as though it, too, was holding its breath. As he drove up the old road leading to End House, he couldn't help but feel a chilling familiarity in the air. The land was still the same, the wild, untamed forest pressing against the cliff where the house once stood. Richard parked his car near the overgrown plot of land. The foundations of the house were barely visible, now swallowed by nature's relentless march. But there was something else. The ground itself seemed to hum with energy, as if the earth was alive beneath his feet. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint echoes of something ancient, something hungry. He stepped out of the car, a sense of dread filling the pit of his stomach. He could feel the land pulling him forward, beckoning him into the forest, as if something was waiting just beyond the trees. Clara was right, Richard whispered to himself, his voice tinged with terror. "This is far from over." And as Richard stepped forward, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The whispering grew louder until it became a deafening roar. The shadows of the past had returned, and they would not let him go. Epilogue. The Silent Watcher. As Richard ventured deeper into the forest, he could feel the weight of centuries pressing in on him. Whatever force had once been contained beneath End House had been set loose, and now it was awake. The shadows whispered, louder and louder, pulling at his very soul. Behind him, Clara stood at the edge of the trees, watching him disappear into the dark forest. She knew that whatever Richard was walking toward was far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. But for the first time, she understood the full truth. End House had never been just a home. It had always been a prison, and the prison doors were now open. Chapter 8. The Shadow in the Forest, Section 1. Into the darkness, Richard's heart pounded as he pushed deeper into the forest. The trees closing in on him like silent sentinels. The air felt thick, oppressive, almost as if the very earth beneath him was holding its breath. His every step seemed to echo through the silence, the whispers in the wind growing louder with each passing moment. The land surrounding End House had always felt alive with a strange energy. But now, as he walked through the overgrown foliage, it was as if something more than the land itself had awakened. The forest seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, each step drawing him closer to something he couldn't see, yet could feel something ancient, powerful, and hungry. He paused, taking a deep breath, his senses on high alert. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he heard the faintest sound behind him. It was like a rustle of leaves, just out of reach. He spun around, but saw nothing. Only the shifting shadows of the forest. No, he told himself, it's nothing, just the wind. But deep down, Richard knew better. The whispers, now louder, felt like they were coming from every direction. It was as if the very trees themselves were speaking to him, their ancient roots reaching into his mind. The language was unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, rhythmic hum, pulling at his thoughts like a slow, drowning current. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a shadow, darker than the night, moving in the distance. It was no animal. It was too fluid, too purposeful. It flickered at the edges of his vision, never staying in one place long enough to make out its form. Richard felt the chill of fear crawl up his spine, but he kept moving forward, compelled by an unknown force. He had to know what had been unleashed, had to face whatever had been lurking in the shadows for so long. Section 2. The Guardian of the Past. As Richard walked deeper into the forest, the ground beneath him became uneven, and the trees grew denser. The light from his flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness that surrounded him. It was as if the world had closed in, trapping him in a maze of twisted branches and tangled undergrowth. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a sound in the wind. It was a voice, a presence that pressed into his very mind. And as the voice whispered his name, he felt the pull of the forest, the overwhelming desire to keep going, to go farther into the unknown. His pace quickened, his heart racing. The shadow he had seen was closer now, moving fluidly between the trees, always just out of reach. His breath came faster, his mind racing with the fear of what lay ahead. He had to keep going. He had to confront it. Then, through the darkness, he saw it. A massive stone structure rose before him. It was ancient, so old that it seemed to belong to another time entirely. The stone was dark, weathered, and etched with strange symbols that Richard couldn't understand. The structure was shaped like a large archway, flanked by two towering stone figures that resembled guardians' figures with faces twisted in silent agony. At the base of the archway, a set of stairs led down into the earth. The whispers came from there, calling to him, beckoning him forward. Richard hesitated for only a moment before descending the stairs. The air grew colder with every step, the walls of the tunnel closing in around him. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing against him, the ancient power of the forest and the land suffocating him. The stairway led into a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with more strange carvings, more symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. In the center of the room stood an altar, identical to the one Richard had found in Endhouse's cellar. But this altar was different. It was larger, more intricate, and the carvings on its surface were even older than the ones in the house. At the altar's base, a faint red light flickered, like the glow of embers in a long-dead fire. The ground around it was stained dark, as if the soil itself had been soaked in blood. Richard's heart raced as he approached the altar. The shadow from the forest was no longer a flicker in his peripheral vision. It had taken form. It was standing before the altar, its shape humanoid, but its features were indistinguishable, just a swirling mass of shadows and smoke. It turned its head slowly toward Richard. The air around him grew cold, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He knew, in that moment, that he was standing face to face with whatever had haunted End House, with the force that had been bound for centuries. "Welcome," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 echoes. "You are the final piece of the puzzle." Richard's heart hammered in his chest. "What is this?" he demanded. "What do you want from me?" The shadow tilted its head, and Richard could feel the weight of its gaze, though its face remained hidden. "What do I want?" The voice was a twisted mockery of a laugh. "I am not the one who wants. Richard, you are the one who has come seeking answers." Richard stood his ground, though fear threatened to overtake him. "I don't want any part of this. I destroyed the house. I destroyed the curse." The figure laughed again, its voice warping and distorting like a broken record. "You did not destroy the curse, Richard. You only released it. The power of the land. The pact your ancestors made it was never meant to be broken, and now you will pay the price." Richard's mind spun as the shadow moved closer, its form becoming more defined. The figure raised a hand, and with a wave, the room around them shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, the ground beneath him quaking. "You are the last of your bloodline." The shadow hissed. "Your family's debt to this land is vast, and now it is time for you to fulfill it." Section 3. The Choice. Richard stumbled backward, his mind reeling. His family's debt. What did that even mean? The shadow seemed to grow in size, the room growing darker with each passing second. Richard's pulse quickened, his heart racing in his chest. The whispers had returned, but now they weren't just voices. They were screams, horrible, tortured cries that came from everywhere, echoing through the chamber. "Do you hear them?" the figure asked, its voice slow and deliberate. "These are the souls of your ancestors, trapped by the pact they made, trapped by the blood they spilled to bind the house to this land." Richard's mind felt as though it was splitting. "No," he whispered, the word barely leaving his lips. This can't be real." The shadow's form shifted again, its smoky tendrils reaching out toward Richard. "It is all real. The power is yours for the taking. The curse is yours to command. If you choose to accept it." Richard's heart pounded in his ears. He could feel the power, the weight of the house's history, pulling at him, trying to claim him. It was like a dark energy seeping into his very bones, a coldness that made him feel as though he was losing himself. His hand shook as he reached for the altar, and the red light flickered brightly, as though the altar itself was waiting for him to make the final choice. "Will you accept the curse, Richard?" the shadow whispered. "Will you become what your ancestors were, the ruler of this land, the master of its dark power?" Richard's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of his bloodline's history pressing down on him. Could he truly embrace this power? Could he control it? Or would it consume him, as it had done to so many before him? The answer came to him in a flash of clarity. "No," he whispered. "I will not be part of this." With those words, the ground beneath him trembled, and the room seemed to shudder. The shadow, let out a terrible, inhuman scream as the altar's red light flickered and dimmed. Richard's body felt as though it were being pulled apart, but he refused to back down. With all the strength he had left, he tore the power from the altar, the darkness ripping from him as he cast the shadow back into the void. Epilogue: The Price of Freedom. The forest was silent once again. The whispers were gone. The oppressive presence lifted from Richard's soul. The ground had stopped shaking. The air no longer felt heavy, but as he stood there, in the aftermath, Richard knew that there would always be a part of him tied to the house, to the land, a part that could never be truly free. End House had been more than just a house. It had been a curse, a legacy that had bound his family for generations. And though he had broken the chains, the weight of what had been lost and what had been gained would remain with him forever. As he walked out of the forest, Clara met him at the edge of the trees. Her eyes were filled with both relief and sorrow. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice quiet. Richard looked back at the land, at the place where End House had once stood, and nodded. "For now," he said, his voice steady but tired. But the shadows never truly fade. They just wait for the next soul to awaken them. And with that, Richard and Clara left the haunted forest behind, knowing that some echoes of the past could never truly be silenced. The darkness would always be waiting just out of sight, but always close enough to hear. Chapter 9. The Unbroken Chain, Section 1. The Weight of Silence. Richard's life after the confrontation in the forest was quieter than he had ever anticipated. The eerie calm that followed the destruction of End House's curse seemed almost too peaceful, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. For weeks, Richard and Clara tried to return to normal. Clara had returned to her work in Silvermere, cautiously continuing her research into the strange happenings around the town. Richard, too, tried to move on, though the weight of the house's legacy still clung to him. But there were nights when Richard lay awake, his mind racing with fragments of memories and whispers he couldn't quite escape. The shadows were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for him to slip. He had freed the land, but in doing so, had he unleashed something even more dangerous? Something that had been sleeping for far longer than the house's curse had lasted. These questions plagued him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions hadn't fully severed the ties between him and the house. Section 2. The Arrival of the Stranger. It was a rainy evening when the stranger arrived at his door. Richard had just sat down with a cup of coffee, the weight of another long day pressing on his shoulders, when a knock echoed through his apartment. He opened the door to find a man standing in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his coat dark and drenched from the storm. The man looked to be in his early 40s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through Richard. His gaze was intense, but his presence was unsettling, as though he carried some heavy secret. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the man said, his voice calm but urgent. "My name is Thomas Blackwood. I need your help." Richard stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Help with what? The stranger's gaze flickered toward the window, his eyes darkening as if he had just come to some grim realization. I've been following your family's history, Thomas continued, and I know what happened at End House. I need to speak with you about something important, something you don't fully understand. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The name Blackwood had a certain ring to it, though he couldn't place where he had heard it before. The stranger's words unsettled him, but something about his demeanor made Richard hesitate. Please, come inside, Richard said finally, stepping aside to allow Thomas in. The storm outside raged on, but the tension in the air felt much more oppressive than the weather could explain. Section 3. The Unseen Web. Thomas Blackwood took a seat in Richard's living room, glancing briefly at the fireplace as though he were sizing up the room. He didn't seem to be in any rush. After a moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. I've spent the last decade researching the power that haunted your family, Thomas said, looking Richard in the eye. And I've discovered something you might not know. The curse of End House, the one you destroyed, is only the surface of a much older and far more dangerous network. Richard stiffened. What do you mean? Thomas's expression grew more serious. What you experienced, Richard, was just a small part of something much larger. The house, the power it contained, is part of an ancient web that spans across the globe. It's not confined to Silvermere or to your family. The curse was only the beginning. There's a greater force at play, one that operates in the shadows of history. Richard's pulse quickened. He felt the air grow thick again, as if the weight of the past was slowly wrapping itself around him once more. What kind of force? The force of the Watchers, Thomas said, his voice reverberating with the weight of his words. An ancient order that has been influencing humanity for millennia. They've been watching, waiting, controlling events from behind the scenes. Richard's mind raced. The Watchers? I've never heard of them. Thomas sighed. No one has. They've worked in the shadows for so long that most people have forgotten they exist. But they were the ones who set everything in motion, your family's involvement with the house, the rituals, the blood sacrifice. They are the reason End House was built in the first place. Section 4. The Unseen War. Richard leaned forward, his hand gripping the edge of his chair. What do you mean? Are you saying my great-grandmother was a part of this order? Not just your great-grandmother, Thomas replied, his voice cold. The entire Graham family. Your ancestors were pawns in a much larger game. Richard, they thought they were controlling the house, controlling the power, but in reality, they were just feeding the Watchers, offering up the blood of their descendants to fuel the dark power they believed they could master. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it was almost too much to comprehend. So the curse. It wasn't just about the house, Richard whispered. No, Thomas said. The house was the physical anchor, but the power it contained is far older, connected to forces beyond this world. When you destroyed the house, you stopped the curse. But you didn't stop the Watchers. They're still out there, operating from the shadows, and their influence runs deep. They're waiting for the right moment to strike again. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Then why are you here? Why are you telling me all this? Thomas's eyes darkened. Because you're the last living Graham. Richard, you're the only one who has the power to stop them. The Watchers believe that they can control you, just as they controlled your ancestors. But they're wrong. You can break the chain. You can stop them before they complete their final plan. Section 5. The unfolding of the plan. Richard stood up, pacing the room. How am I supposed to stop them? What exactly are they planning? Thomas looked at him with a mixture of urgency and despair. The Watchers are after something more than just control. They want to reshape the very fabric of reality itself. They have already begun manipulating the fabric of time, trying to influence past and future events to create a world where they are the rulers, a world that can never escape their control. They are using ancient rituals, powerful technology, and dark magic to pull the strings. And you think I can stop them? Richard asked incredulously. Thomas's eyes locked onto his. Yes, but it won't be easy. The Watchers are more powerful than you can imagine. They will stop at nothing to achieve their goal. You'll need to face them head on. You'll need to learn the truth about your family's past, about the role Endhouse played in all of this, and most importantly, about what they want from you. Richard's heart raced. Could he really stop this? Could he confront an ancient force that had been pulling the strings of humanity for centuries? You'll have to go back, Thomas said, standing up and walking toward the door. Back to Silvermere. Back to the land where it all began. Only then can you uncover the truth and stop the Watchers. Richard nodded, a wave of determination flooding through him. He had faced the darkness before, but now the stakes were higher than ever. This time, the battle wasn't just for his family's legacy. It was for the fate of the entire world. Epilogue: The Road to Silvermere. As Richard watched Thomas disappear into the night, he knew that his journey was far from over. The Watchers were still out there, hidden in the shadows, and their plans were just beginning to unfold. With the weight of his family's cursed past now weighing heavily on his shoulders, Richard had no choice but to return to Silvermere. He couldn't ignore the pull of the land, the legacy of the house, and the dark forces that had shaped his family's history. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. Clara's warning echoed in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the world, and as he prepared for the long road ahead, Richard knew one thing for certain: he would stop the Watchers, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. The Return to Silvermere, Section 1. The Familiar Road. The journey back to Silvermere felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, that Richard couldn't quite wake from. The car moved along the familiar winding roads, the landscape unchanged, the hills and forests seeming just as they had in his childhood. But something was different now. The town had a darkness hanging over it that hadn't been there before, an unsettling sense of foreboding that Richard could feel in his bones. As he drove past the old, abandoned houses, the feeling intensified. Silvermere had always been a quiet town, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. But now, every corner, every empty lot, seemed to whisper secrets that Richard could not decipher. He could still see the silhouette of Endhouse on the cliff in the distance, its ruins barely visible through the dense trees. The house, now nothing more than rubble, had held its dark secrets for so long. And yet, the whispers seemed to linger in the air. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had destroyed the house, He had destroyed the curse, or so he thought. Now, the Watchers, a force far older and more dangerous than anything he had ever faced, were still out there, watching, waiting. Clara's warnings echoed in his mind. You're not just fighting for your family anymore, Richard. You're fighting for everyone. Section 2. The Gathering Shadows. As Richard arrived in Silvermere, the town seemed almost too quiet. It was a late afternoon, the skies heavy with the threat of rain, and the streets were empty. Even the town's usual bustle felt stifled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He drove through the familiar roads, passing the old town square and the small shops that had been around for as long as he could remember. But as he neared the outskirts of the town, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A group of strangers gathered in front of the town's old church. They were wearing long coats, hoods drawn up to obscure their faces. There was something deliberate in their gathering, a ritualistic sense of purpose that made Richard's instincts flare. They weren't just town residents. They were out of place, as if they had appeared from nowhere. As he drove past, one of them looked up and locked eyes with him. The figure's gaze was piercing, cold, and familiar, but Richard couldn't place where he had seen those eyes before. He quickly turned away and drove toward the small cottage he had rented in Silvermere, the place where he would plan his next steps. But the encounter lingered in his mind. Who were they? And why had they been waiting in front of the church? Section 3. Clara's Warning. That evening, Clara arrived at Richard's cottage. She looked exhausted, her face drawn with the same concern that had marked their last conversation. I went to the town square earlier, Clara said, her voice tense. And I saw them too. The strangers, Richard asked. Frowning, Clara nodded. Yes, they're here, Richard. They've been gathering in the town, and I've found out some disturbing things. These people, they're part of a cult that traces its roots back to the Watchers. Richard's heart skipped a beat. A cult. They call themselves the Children of the Eternal Watchers, Clara explained, sitting down at the table and looking at Richard with urgency. They've been operating in secret for centuries, working alongside the Watchers, making sure that the Watchers' influence remains strong. They believe that the only way to achieve ultimate power is to let the Watchers consume humanity. They are fanatics. Richard's mind raced. How do you know this? I found records, Clara replied, her fingers trembling as she opened a file on her tablet. These people have been in Silvermere for a long time, quietly pulling the strings, manipulating events behind the scenes. When you destroyed End House, you didn't just stop the curse. You broke the chain, and they've been preparing ever since. Richard felt his throat tighten. So they were waiting for me. Clara's eyes were heavy with sorrow. Yes, they know you're the last of the Graham bloodline, and they believe that you have the key to their ultimate goal, to resurrect the power of the Watchers and bring about their reign. The Watchers aren't just interested in controlling the world. Richard, they want to merge with it, and they will do whatever it takes to make that happen. Section 4. The Hidden Temple. The next morning, Richard and Clara set out to investigate the stranger's presence in Silvermere. Their first stop was the old church where the cult members had been gathered. The church was an ancient building, its stone walls weathered by time, and the air inside was thick with dust and stale air. As they entered, Clara pulled Richard toward a hidden door at the back of the church. "This leads to a crypt beneath the church. It's been abandoned for years, but I believe the cult uses it as their base." They descended the narrow stone stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The crypt was cold and damp, its stone walls covered in centuries of grime. At the far end of the crypt, Richard noticed something unusual: a large stone door, covered with ancient runes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Clara turned to him, her face pale. "This is it, the Watcher's final resting place." Richard's heart beat faster. "What is behind this door?" Clara hesitated before answering. "The Watchers are not just a force of darkness. They are bound to a different plane of existence, and they've been trying to open a doorway into our world for centuries. This door, Richard, is the key." Richard stepped closer, running his fingers over the runes. He could feel the power beneath his fingertips, an energy unlike anything he had ever experienced before. This was no ordinary door. It was a portal, a gateway that the cult would use to unleash the Watchers upon the world once more. Suddenly, the stone door began to shake, and a low rumble filled the air. The symbols on the door began to glow, growing brighter by the second. "They've already begun," Clara whispered. "They're trying to open it." Richard turned to her, his mind racing. "We need to stop them, now." Section 5. The Final Confrontation. The crypt trembled as the door slowly began to open, revealing a swirling darkness beyond. The shadows twisted and shifted, forming shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. Richard could feel the weight of the darkness pulling at him, as if the very air around him was alive. "This is it," Clara said, her voice shaking. "We have to close it before they complete the ritual." As the portal widened, cult members began to gather in the chamber, chanting in an ancient, guttural language. Richard and Clara tried to move toward the door, but the ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the shadows began to take form. Reaching out to stop them, the figure of the leader, the man Richard had seen earlier in town, emerged from the darkness. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his voice resonated through the crypt as he spoke the final words of the ritual. "It is too late," the leader said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "The Watchers will rise, and we will rule the earth." Richard felt a surge of power course through him, the weight of his ancestors' curse pressing down on him. He stepped forward, raising his hands to the portal, his voice trembling as he spoke the words he had learned from the ancient texts Clara had uncovered. "By the blood of my forefathers, I break the seal." With a flash of blinding light, the portal exploded in a wave of energy. The cult members screamed as the darkness was pulled back into the void, the portal slamming shut with a deafening roar. For a moment, the crypt was silent. The air was thick with the remnants of the battle, but the evil that had once threatened Silvermere had been sealed away once more. Epilogue. The calm after the storm. The storm outside Silvermere had subsided, and the town felt strangely peaceful once more. Richard and Clara stood together at the edge of the crypt, the air around them heavy with the aftermath of their battle. "It's over," Clara whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Richard looked at her, his mind still racing. "For now," he said, his voice quiet. "But I know this isn't the last time we'll face the Watchers. They've been waiting for too long. Clara nodded. The shadows never truly fade. As Richard looked out over Silvermere, he knew one thing for certain. No matter how many battles they won, the fight against the darkness would never truly end. But as long as he stood, as long as Clara stood by his side, they would keep fighting for the world, for their future, and for the legacy that still haunted them. And when the darkness returned, they would be ready. Chapter 11. The Awakening of the Watchers, Section 1. Aftermath. The town of Silvermere had returned to its usual quiet pace. But for Richard and Clara, the peace was fleeting. The darkness they had faced, the ancient power they had sealed away beneath the crypt, left an echo in their minds. They had stopped the ritual. They had closed the door. But the weight of what they had done, what they had barely prevented, lingered heavily in the air. They sat together in Richard's small cottage that evening, the quiet of the night surrounding them. The only sound was the gentle crackling of the fire, its warmth offering little comfort against the uncertainty that gripped Richard's thoughts. "I thought we'd finished this," Richard murmured, running a hand through his hair. "I thought we destroyed the curse, but it's like something bigger is out there, something more powerful than the house." Clara, her gaze fixed on the fire, nodded slowly. "You've always known, Richard, the Watchers. They're not just a cult, they're a force, an ancient, collective entity that exists beyond time and space. You can't just destroy them." Richard clenched his fists. "But we stopped them. We closed the portal. They can't come through." "Not yet," Clara said quietly, her eyes distant. "But they will. They've been watching for centuries. They know your bloodline. Richard, they know you." The weight of her words hit Richard with a new wave of dread. "Then what are we supposed to do? How do we stop them for good?" Clara looked at him, her expression somber. "The Watchers have always been here, in the background, pulling the strings. And they've been preparing for the moment when their power would finally return to the world. The question isn't if they'll come back, it's when." Richard stood up abruptly, his mind racing. "If they're coming back, we need to be ready. We can't wait until they're too strong to fight." Section 2. The Search for the Key. Clara's research had turned up something troubling, a passage in the ancient texts she had found years ago. It spoke of a second key, a hidden artifact that could not only lock away the Watchers for good, but destroy their power entirely. But the location of the key was a mystery, and it was said to be scattered across several forgotten sites, all linked to the Watchers' ancient influence. Richard knew that time was not on their side. The Watchers' cult had already begun making moves, and their influence was spreading like wildfire. If they didn't find the key, if they didn't figure out how to destroy the Watchers once and for all, they would be powerless to stop the coming storm. Clara turned to him, her face set in determination. "There's no time to waste. We need to go after it. Richard, but we can't do this alone. We'll need help." Richard nodded. "Agreed. But we need to be careful. The Watchers won't let us find it without a fight." Clara's eyes darkened. "Then we fight." Section 3. The Hunt Begins. The first lead took them to an ancient abbey just outside Silvermere, a place long abandoned, rumored to be a site of powerful rituals and dark magic. According to the texts Clara had uncovered, This was one of the Watchers' earliest strongholds. It was said that the key had been hidden there centuries ago, in a crypt beneath the abbey, guarded by the Watcher's most loyal servants. The journey was long and treacherous, but Richard and Clara knew there was no turning back. As they approached the abbey, the air seemed to grow heavier, the sense of foreboding almost suffocating. The abbey was perched on a hill, its dark silhouette cutting a jagged line against the stormy sky. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the stone walls were covered in creeping vines, as if nature itself was reclaiming the place. "This is it," Richard said, his voice steady, but filled with unease. "We're close." Clara nodded, her hand on the hilt of the dagger she had brought for protection. "We need to find the crypt, and we need to do it fast." They entered the abbey, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The remnants of old pews lay scattered around, their wood long rotted away. The stone walls were covered in faded frescoes, depicting scenes of angels and demons locked in eternal battle. "This place is ancient," Clara murmured, her eyes scanning the walls. "These murals, they were made by the Watchers." Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Let's find that crypt." They descended into the bowels of the abbey, through narrow hallways and forgotten passageways. Finally, they reached a large stone door, its surface etched with strange runes. Clara examined the door closely, her fingers tracing the symbols. "This is it," she whispered. "This door. It leads to the crypt." Richard stepped forward, his hand on the door. It was cold to the touch, and as he pushed, the door groaned loudly, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. With a final push, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, dank chamber. The crypt was vast, filled with old, crumbling tombs and the smell of death that lingered in the air. At the far end of the crypt stood a pedestal, its surface empty. But Richard's heart skipped a beat when he saw what was etched into the floor, the same runes that had been on the altar at Endhouse. "Unmansamstus." "This is where the key was hidden," Clara said, her voice almost a whisper. "But it's gone." Richard clenched his fists in frustration. How? It was supposed to be here. Clara's gaze fell to the stone floor. "The Watchers have already moved it. They're one step ahead of us." Section 4. The Price of Power. As they stood in the empty crypt, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow more menacing. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here, Richard." Clara's hand went to her dagger, her body tensing in preparation for an attack. Richard turned sharply, his eyes searching the darkness for the source of the voice. Out of the shadows emerged the figure of the cult leader they had seen before. The man with glowing eyes. He stepped into the light, his face cold and unreadable. "The Watchers have seen you," he said. "You are too late." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What do you want?" The cult leader smiled, though there was no warmth in his expression. "The Watchers are already here, Richard. You cannot stop them. You cannot even begin to understand the power that lies before you." "You're wrong," Richard said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I will stop them. I will stop you." The cult leader's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. You think you can defeat us? The Watchers have shaped the course of history. They have been with humanity since the dawn of time. There is nothing you can do to change that. Clara stepped forward, her eyes blazing. You're a fool if you think you've already won. We will fight. We will destroy the Watchers. The cult leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. The battle is already over, and you, Richard Graham, are the key to everything. You cannot escape your fate. With those final words, the chamber began to tremble, the walls vibrating as though the very ground beneath them was awakening. Richard could feel the pressure in the air, the weight of the Watcher's presence closing in on him. They had been watching, waiting for him to make his final choice. But Richard wouldn't be their pawn. He had to act now. The power of his ancestors was not his to wield, but perhaps it was theirs to destroy. Epilogue. The final choice. The battle for Silvermere, for Richard's soul, and for the fate of humanity was just beginning. The Watchers had shown their hand, but Richard's resolve had hardened. Clara stood by his side, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. But the path ahead was unclear. Richard had no idea what would come next, only that he had one final choice to make. Would he give in to the power of the Watchers, or would he stand and fight, even against an enemy that had been shaping the world for centuries? The answers, he knew, lay hidden in the ancient ruins of Silvermere, and as long as he drew breath, he would search for them. The Watchers would not have the last word. Chapter 12. The Descent into Shadows. Section 1. The Bloodline's Burden. Richard and Clara stood at the edge of the crypt, the oppressive darkness pressing in on them from all sides. The cult leader's words had rattled Richard's mind, echoing in the hollow of his skull. You are the key to everything. The weight of that statement, the idea that his bloodline was irrevocably tied to the Watcher's plan, gnawed at him. Was he merely the last link in a chain of centuries-old manipulation? A pawn in a game he had never truly understood. We need to get out of here, Clara said, her voice sharp, breaking through Richard's spiraling thoughts. The Watchers are close. We don't have much time. Richard shook his head, his grip tightening on the stone pillar next to him. I won't run anymore. They think they've already won, but they haven't seen what we're capable of. Clara's expression softened, and she stepped closer. I know you're scared, Richard, but we have to stay focused. The Watchers won't just let us walk away. They will come for us, and they won't stop. Richard's eyes met hers, filled with both fear and determination. He wasn't just fighting for his family's redemption anymore. He was fighting for the world, for everyone who had been unknowingly touched by the Watcher's influence. He took a deep breath. Then we fight him. Section 2. The Gathering Forces. As the two of them made their way back to the surface, Richard's thoughts raced. The cult had gained power over the years, and now that the Watchers were waking, they would stop at nothing to bring their dark plan to fruition. Richard and Clara had made a choice, but the path forward was uncertain. The following days were spent preparing. Richard knew they needed more than just courage to confront the Watchers. They needed allies. As he'd learned through his family's cursed history, the Watchers had infiltrated every corner of society. But they had also made enemies' enemies who would be willing to fight with them, if they could find them. Clara, using her connections from her research, managed to locate several individuals who had been tracking the Watchers from the Shadow's former historians, rogue scientists, and even defectors from the cult. These people had spent their lives uncovering the truth about the Watchers, but for fear of the cult's retaliation, they had stayed hidden. They met in secret in the old library beneath the town's historical society. The room was dimly lit, filled with ancient texts and maps. The walls seemed to close in around them, but for the first time since Richard had returned to Silvermere, he felt a glimmer of hope. These people had fought against the Watchers in their own ways, and now they had come together to join the fight. "This isn't just about stopping the Watchers," said one of the historians, a man named Edgar. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp. "It's about rewriting the future. The Watchers have shaped history in their image. We're not just trying to kill them. We're trying to undo their influence, to take back what they've stolen." Richard nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were facing. "We have to find the key, the second one, and we need to destroy the portal they've opened. But we also need to stop the Watchers from ever coming back." Another woman, Elena, a former scientist who had studied dark energy, spoke up. "There's one more thing. The Watchers don't just draw power from their followers. They draw power from time itself. If we want to stop them, we need to understand how they manipulate history. We need to find a way to close the rift they've created." Richard turned to Clara, who nodded. "We'll figure it out, together." But even as the group began to form their plans, Richard couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. The Watchers were close. They were everywhere. And time was running out. Section 3. The Heart of the Watchers. The group spent days searching through old tomes, hidden texts, and deciphering maps that had been long lost to history. Every clue led them closer to the heart of the Watchers' power, an ancient, forgotten temple hidden deep beneath the earth. The temple, according to the texts, was where the Watchers had first emerged, where they had made their pact with humanity. It was the birthplace of their dark influence. If the temple could be destroyed, it was said that the Watchers' hold on the world would break. Clara worked tirelessly, piecing together the information from the texts, while Richard met with the others, preparing for the final journey. The air felt thick with tension as the days passed, the weight of what was ahead pressing down on them all. On the final night before their departure, Richard sat alone in his cottage, looking out over the town of Silvermere. The streets were quiet, and the rain had stopped, leaving the world shrouded in mist. His thoughts returned to his great-grandmother, Evelyn Graham, and the legacy she had left behind. Had she truly known the cost of her actions? Had she foreseen the destruction that would come? The whispers of the past seemed to echo in his ears, but he silenced them. He had made his choice. The Watchers would not claim another soul. Section 4. The Descent into Darkness. The path to the temple was treacherous, winding through dense forests and forgotten tunnels that had been untouched for centuries. The air grew colder with every step they took, and the ground beneath them felt like it was shifting, as if the earth itself was alive. As they reached the entrance to the temple, Richard felt a sudden surge of power, a dark energy that seemed to pull at his very soul. He could feel the Watcher's presence now, their influence seeping into every crack and crevice of the ancient structure. The door to the temple was massive, adorned with runes that pulsed with a faint light. The energy around it was palpable, and Richard could feel the weight of history pressing against him. Every step toward the door felt like a step closer to the abyss. Clara stepped forward, holding an ancient relic in her hand. It was the final piece they needed, the key that would unlock the temple and allow them to destroy it from within. Richard's heart pounded as Clara inserted the key into the lock. The door groaned and creaked, slowly opening to reveal the temple's interior. The air inside was thick, heavy with centuries of dark energy. "We're not just closing the temple," Richard said, his voice low. "We're destroying it." Clara nodded. "We destroy the heart of the Watcher's power, and we end this for good." Section 5. The Final Battle. As the door opened, Richard and Clara entered the heart of the temple. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with strange carvings, each one depicting the rise of the Watchers and their influence over mankind. The air hummed with dark energy, and in the center of the chamber stood an ancient altar, its surface covered with blood-red runes. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and the temperature dropped. The Watchers were here. Richard could feel their presence in every corner of the chamber, their eyes watching, waiting. It was as if the temple itself was alive, breathing with a malevolent force. The cult members appeared, emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. They chanted in the ancient language, their voices rising in unison as they prepared to complete the ritual. Richard stepped forward, his hands shaking, but his resolve firm. He had come too far to turn back now. "This ends now," he said, his voice strong. "We will break your hold over this world." The cult leader stepped forward, his glowing eyes locking on to Richard's. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The Watchers will rise, and humanity will kneel before them." With a final, defiant yell, Richard raised his hand, summoning the power he had learned to wield. He reached for the relic that Clara had brought, and as he pressed it against the altar, the entire temple shook, its walls cracking as the Watcher's power began to unravel. The ground trembled violently as the temple began to collapse, the altar's power fading. The cult members screamed as the temple's dark energy was consumed by the light. The Watcher's presence flickered and then vanished, their hold on the world severed. In the chaos that followed, Richard and Clara made their way back through the crumbling temple, the echoes of the Watcher's screams fading into nothingness. Hercule Poirot. Epilogue. The last light. Silvermere was quiet again. The darkness that had plagued the town for so long had finally lifted, and the oppressive presence of the Watchers was gone. Richard and Clara stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the ruins of the temple in the distance. The battle had been long, and the cost had been high. But for the first time, Richard felt the weight of his family's curse lifted. The darkness had been vanquished, and the world was free. But Richard knew that the battle against the shadows was never truly over. The Watchers may have been defeated, but the echoes of their influence would linger in the corners of history, waiting for the next soul to awaken them. And when that time came, Richard and Clara would be ready. Chapter 13. The Echo of the Void. Section 1. A new beginning. The sun had risen over Silvermere, but it felt different. The town that had once been heavy with shadows now seemed bathed in light. The cursed power of the Watchers, the ancient entity that had haunted Richard's bloodline for centuries, had been broken. The oppressive weight that had pressed on him since his return to Silvermere had lifted, but in its place, there was something else, something he couldn't shake. Oh, Richard stood by the window of his small cottage, looking out over the quiet town. The streets were peaceful, the clouds drifting lazily across the sky. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, a nagging feeling remained, like a distant echo that refused to fade. He turned to Clara, who was sitting by the table, quietly writing in a notebook. Despite the victory, there was a certain stillness to her that mirrored his own unease. "It's over," Richard said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We've stopped them. The Watchers are gone." Clara looked up from her notes, her eyes soft but thoughtful. "Are we sure of that?" Richard. Her words struck a chord. Richard had asked himself the same question countless times in the days following the destruction of the temple. While the Watcher's immediate threat had been eradicated, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. There were too many unknowns, too many unanswered questions. "The temple is gone," Richard replied. "The rift is closed. The cult members, they're either dead or scattered. We've won." Clara stood up, her gaze unwavering. "Perhaps, but remember, Richard, power like that doesn't simply disappear. The Watchers were not just men. They were an idea, a force. The destruction of the temple may have stopped their immediate influence. But what about everything they built? The network they created? The cracks they've left in the world?" Richard turned away from the window, his mind racing with Clara's words. "Are you suggesting it's not over, that something else could rise?" She shook her head slowly. "Not suggesting. I'm warning. We might have stopped them, but the legacy of their influence, the shadows they cast, still exist, and those who have been touched by it may not be as willing to let go." Kio. Section 2. The whisper in the dark days passed, but the unease only grew. Richard and Clara had started to rebuild their lives in Silvermere, quietly moving forward, yet always glancing over their shoulders. The town was peaceful, but it felt fragile, like a thin veneer of calm stretched over an ocean of uncertainty. One evening, as Richard was walking back from the market, he noticed something that stopped him dead in his tracks. At the edge of town, near the old church, a lone figure stood watching him from the shadows. It was a woman, her face obscured by a hood. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Richard froze, his instincts screaming at him to approach with caution. He took a slow step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman did not move. She simply watched him. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice steady but tense. The woman didn't answer at first. She took a single step closer, then lifted her head slightly, revealing a face that seemed both familiar and strange. Her eyes glowed with an eerie light, the same glow Richard had seen in the eyes of the cult leader before. "I know you," the woman said softly, her voice cold as ice. "And I know what you did." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want?" The woman tilted her head, a slow, almost pitying smile creeping across her lips. "I want to warn you. What you stopped wasn't the end. It was only a chapter." The words struck Richard like a physical blow. He could feel the blood drain from his face. "Who are you?" he asked again. More urgently this time, she took another step toward him, her presence almost suffocating. "I am what remains," she whispered. "I am the last of the Watchers. And you, Richard Graham, are not free." Section 3. The Price of Silence. The woman's words rattled Richard to his core. He had thought the Watchers had been destroyed, their influence erased. But this woman, with her glowing eyes and cold demeanor, was a reminder of the legacy they had left behind. She was something he hadn't anticipated a remnant of the Watchers' reach, an individual who had escaped their fall. "I thought it was over," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "We ended it. The temple is gone. The power was sealed." She laughed softly, the sound chilling in its detachment. "Power isn't destroyed. It's transformed. The Watchers don't need their temple anymore. Richard, they have you." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "What do you mean, I destroyed the altar?" "I closed the rift." "You closed one door," the woman replied, her eyes narrowing. "But you didn't close them all. The Watchers are not just bound by space. They exist through belief, through their influence on the minds of the weak. They still have their followers, and they are still watching." Richard's pulse quickened. "What do you want from me?" She stepped forward, her hand reaching out slowly as if to touch his face. "The same thing they always wanted," she whispered. "Control." Richard stepped back, shaking his head. "You're lying. It's over. It has to be over." Her smile was slow, deliberate. "We'll see, Richard. We'll see." With that, the woman turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Richard standing alone, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. Section 4. The Gathering Storm. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Richard and Clara both felt the shift, the growing tension that had once been silent, but was now louder than ever. It wasn't just the town. It was the world itself. The Watchers, though defeated in their physical form, had spread their influence across society. The seeds of their power were planted deep, and Richard could feel them stirring. He didn't know what the woman had meant. Was she truly the last of the Watchers? Was there more to the prophecy than they had uncovered? Clara sensed it, too. "I don't believe her," she said, after Richard told her about the encounter. "But I also don't think we've seen the last of them. There are too many loose ends." Richard nodded grimly. "We need to find out what happened to the remnants. Who else could still be out there? Who else could be carrying the Watcher's legacy?" Clara took a deep breath, then glanced at the maps and old texts they had been studying for the past few weeks. "We need to dig deeper. We need to find out if anyone else is still trying to bring them back." Section 5. The Call to Action. That night, Richard lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the encounter with the woman over and over. There was something unsettling about the way she had spoken to him, like a prophecy he hadn't yet fully understood. She had said he wasn't free, and that thought weighed heavily on him. He couldn't allow the Watcher's influence to spread again. Not after everything he had fought for. Not after the cost of so many lives. But how could he stop something that wasn't bound by time, by space, or by anything tangible? The answer he knew, was simple. He had to go deeper, into the places where the Watchers had hidden themselves, into the hearts of those who still believed in their power. As he sat up in bed, Richard made a decision. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Epilogue: The road ahead. The next morning, Richard stood by the window of his cottage, looking out over the town. It seemed peaceful, serene, but beneath that calm, he knew the storm was coming. The Watchers were not defeated. They were still out there, lurking in the shadows. And this time, Richard was ready to face them head on. As he turned to leave the cottage, Clara entered with a map in her hand. "I found something," she said, her voice steady. "There's an old ruin, far from here. It's linked to the Watcher's past." Richard glanced at her, the determination in his eyes unwavering. "Let's go then. We're not stopping until this is over." Together they walked out into the unknown, prepared to face whatever came next. The battle for the world's future had only just begun. Chapter 14. The Abyss of Time. Section 1. Unraveling the Past. The air outside was heavy with the promise of rain. The sky a swirling mix of deep blues and grays, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the world's history. Richard and Clara stood together in front of the old map spread across the table in their temporary safe house. The map was dotted with locations circled in red, all places connected to the Watchers. Hidden remnants of their power scattered across the world. "This is bigger than we thought," Clara said, tracing her finger over the map. "Each of these places holds a fragment of the Watcher's influence. We've been fighting the effects of their power, but we haven't yet understood the full scope of what they've done." Richard clenched his jaw, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The Watchers are not just a cult. They are a force that has been manipulating human history. I don't think we can stop them by just closing doors. We have to take down their foundations, every last piece of their power. Clara nodded. "But we don't even know where to start. This ruin I found, the one that's connected to the Watcher's origins, could be our best shot. It's not just a temple or a crypt. It's a place tied to the Watcher's first emergence into this world." Richard's mind raced. "Then we have to go there. We need to uncover their origins, destroy their connection to the world once and for all." But Clara hesitated. "Richard, there's something more, something I didn't tell you. In one of the texts I found, there's mention of a ritual that was meant to awaken the Watcher's true power. It's not just about stopping them from entering the world. It's about preventing them from coming back at all. Ever." Richard's eyes met hers, a flicker of realization passing through him. "You mean there's a way to destroy them completely?" Clara nodded slowly. "But it's not something we can do alone. The ritual requires a sacrifice, a great one." Richard took a step back, the gravity of her words settling over him. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" "I don't know yet," Clara said softly. "But if we want to truly break the Watcher's grip on this world, we'll have to pay a price." Section 2. The Path to the Ruin. The journey to the ruin was long and arduous. The location Clara had uncovered was deep in the heart of the Scottish Highlands, far from the reach of modern civilization. The terrain was treacherous, a mix of rocky mountains and dense forests, and as Richard and Clara made their way through the wilderness, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The path was narrow, the jagged cliffs rising on either side like silent sentinels. The deeper they ventured into the wilderness, the stronger the sense of foreboding became. The wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers, the same whispers that had followed them ever since Richard's return to Silvermere. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like the watcher's presence closing in on them. It was as if they were being drawn closer to something much older and darker than they had ever imagined. This place, it feels alive, Clara murmured, looking around uneasily, like it's watching us. Richard glanced over at her. I know. I've felt it too. But we have no choice. We need to find the ritual site before they do. The closer they got to the ruin, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew twisted and gnarled. Their bark blackened and scarred. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet felt more unstable, as though it, too, was being affected by whatever dark force lingered in this place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the entrance to the ruin, a set of ancient stone pillars, overgrown with moss and ivy, marking the entrance to a cavern that seemed to swallow the light. This is it, Clara said, her voice filled with awe and fear. Richard's heart raced. Let's go. We don't have much time. Section 3. The Temple of Shadows. Inside the ruin. The air was thick with an ancient energy. The walls covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift as they moved through the cavern. The floor was smooth and cold, but the walls were jagged, as though the earth itself had been torn open to reveal this hidden place. At the center of the ruin stood a large altar, its surface etched with symbols identical to those Richard had seen at End House. The altar was surrounded by a circular stone platform, covered in more of the same shifting symbols. The very ground seemed to pulse with dark energy, as if the ruin itself was a living thing, drawing power from the earth and sky. This place feels wrong, Clara whispered, her eyes scanning the cavern. Richard nodded, unease creeping through him. It's the Watchers. They're still here, even if they're not physically present. Clara knelt down beside the altar, studying the markings on the stone. This is it. This is the site of the ritual, the one that would have fully awakened the Watchers. Richard stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the symbols. What do we need to do to stop it? Clara traced her fingers along the carvings. We have to activate the ritual to reverse the flow of power. The Watchers were bound to this place by an ancient force. If we reverse that energy, we can destroy them forever. Richard's heart pounded. And the sacrifice. Clara looked up at him, her expression somber. It requires one of us to give up something irreplaceable. A life, a memory, something that binds us to this world. Richard's stomach twisted. He didn't want to think about what that meant. The cost of the Watcher's power wasn't just a ritual. It was a price that would demand everything. Section 4. The Ritual of Fire. Clara and Richard stood together at the altar, the air around them thick with an ancient energy. Clara spoke in a low, incantatory voice, reading from the texts she had uncovered. The symbols around them began to glow, their shapes shifting and pulsing with a dark, eerie light. The cavern rumbled, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The Watcher's presence grew stronger, the whispers growing louder almost deafening. Richard's head throbbed with the force of it, the ancient voices pressing against his mind. He turned to Clara, his face pale. "What's happening? We're not ready." Clara's face was strained, her eyes filled with a deep determination. "We have no choice. Richard, we have to finish the ritual." The altar began to glow brighter, the symbols shifting rapidly. The air grew hotter, thick with the oppressive force of the ritual. A dark storm formed above them, swirling with black clouds, as the Watcher's power surged through the ruin. "Richard," Clara whispered, "I can feel it. The price is coming. Are you ready?" Richard nodded, his hands trembling. "I don't know what will happen after this, but I know we can't let them win." Clara turned to face him, her expression softening. "We'll end this together." With that, Clara took Richard's hand, and together they completed the final incantation. The energy in the cavern erupted in a blinding flash of light, the earth shaking violently as the Watcher's power began to unravel. Richard's mind was flooded with images of the Watcher's ancient rise, their fall, and the twisted legacy they had left behind. The air was thick with power, and the chamber began to collapse around them. As the energy peaked, Clara screamed, her body glowing with light, and Richard felt the pull of the ritual tighten around them. And then the world went silent. Epoche, the end of the beginning. The storm dissipated. The ground stopped shaking. Richard and Clara stood in the ruins, the altar now silent, the symbols fading into nothingness. The cavern was still, the energy gone. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, as if the world was holding its breath. The Watcher's influence had been severed, but at what cost? Clara collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. Richard rushed to her side, his heart in his throat. "Clara," she looked up at him, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. "We did it," she whispered. "We stopped them." But Richard could feel the weight of the loss. Clara had given something up, something irretrievable, to complete the ritual. And he knew, deep down, that their fight was never truly over. The Watchers might have been defeated, but their legacy would live on, and the shadows they left would continue to echo through time. But for now, they had won. For now, the darkness had receded, and together they could face whatever came next. Chapter 15, The Shifting Horizon, Section 1, The Veil of Silence. The air in the cavern was still, but there was an unsettling sense of completion. The Watchers, whose dark influence had rippled through the world for centuries, were no more, or so Richard and Clara hoped. The ritual had been a success, and the power that had once surged through the land had dissipated like a fading storm. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick fog that hung over them, both liberating and suffocating. Clara was still kneeling on the ground, her breath shallow but steady. Richard crouched beside her, concern etched on his face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were distant, as though the energy of the ritual had taken more than she had intended to give. "Clara, are you all right?" Richard asked, his voice tight with worry. "What did you give up?" Clara met his gaze with a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "The Watchers don't let go easily, Richard. But their power isn't something that just fades. To truly sever their connection to this world, we had to become part of the ritual ourselves. The sacrifice. It was the only way. Richard felt a chill creep down his spine as he understood. She had given something that could never be returned. The price had been heavy, but Clara's strength and resolve had carried them both through it. You've done more than anyone could ask of you, Richard whispered, his voice breaking slightly. Clara nodded, but her smile faltered. It's not over. The Watcher's influence doesn't vanish without leaving ripples. What we did, it will have consequences. Section 2. The Awakening. They returned to Silvermere, but even the calm after the storm felt like an illusion. The town was quieter than it had ever been, but Richard felt as if they were walking in the shadow of something they had yet to understand. The Watchers were gone, but the legacy they left behind still lingered, like a stain that could never be washed away. Days passed, and the silence that had followed the ritual became increasingly uncomfortable. Richard and Clara knew that they had broken something. But had they truly defeated the Watchers? Or had they only disrupted their plan for the moment? Richard found it hard to sleep. His dreams were filled with fractured visions, images of Endhouse, of the ancient temple, of the darkness that had once consumed him, the echoes of those voices, the whispers that had plagued him for so long, still lingered in the back of his mind. One night, he awoke with a jolt, drenched in sweat. He looked around, his breath coming in short bursts. And the first thing he noticed was the sound. The whispering was back, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing moment. He glanced over at Clara, who was asleep beside him. But the whispers were not from her. They came from outside the cottage, a soft, eerie hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Richard stood up, his heart racing, and quietly moved to the door. He opened it just a crack, peering into the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows over the town. And there, standing at the edge of the woods, was the same figure he had seen before, the woman with glowing eyes. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, figures cloaked in darkness stood silently, watching, waiting. Richard's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't over. Section 3. The Return of the Watchers. The figure turned slowly, locking eyes with Richard. Her gaze was not just cold. It was filled with a knowing, a certainty that struck Richard to his core. The whispers that had filled his mind before were now clear, like voices from a dream he couldn't escape. "I told you," she called softly, her voice carrying on the wind, "that you would never be free." Richard stepped outside, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman smiled, a cruel, unfeeling expression that sent a chill running down his spine. The Watchers were never gone. "Richard, you sealed away only one piece of the puzzle. The others are awakening, and soon the world will tremble once again under their rule." It was never about one cult, one ritual, one sacrifice. It was always about control. Behind her, the figures shifted, their forms undulating like smoke, as if they were made of shadows themselves. Richard could feel their presence, even from where he stood, an insidious force that seemed to draw the very air from his lungs. "You were never meant to stop them." "Richard," the woman continued, her voice low and mocking. You were meant to become one of them. Richard's blood ran cold. The weight of her words hit him like a wave. Had his bloodline always been the key? Had his ancestors always been destined to serve the Watchers? No, Richard said, shaking his head in disbelief. You're lying. The woman stepped closer, her form blurring in the moonlight. I never lie. Richard, you are the last of the Grahams. Your family's legacy has always been tied to the Watchers. You have the power to either rule or destroy. But in the end, the Watchers will rise again, and you will choose. Richard's fists clenched. I won't let that happen. Then you will be destroyed. The woman replied coldly, Your choice is inevitable. The figures behind her shifted once more, and Richard felt a growing pressure, as though the very earth itself was closing in on him. The whispering grew louder, and suddenly, Clara was beside him, her eyes wide with fear. What's happening? She whispered. Richard turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. The Watchers are still here. This isn't over. And I don't know if we can stop them. Section 4, The Last Choice. As the figures began to move toward them, Richard and Clara stood together, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. The Watcher's power had never truly disappeared. It had only been hidden, dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But Richard knew something that he hadn't known before. The Watchers weren't invincible. Their strength came from their followers, from the fear they spread, from the ancient pact that bound them. They thrived on manipulation, on controlling those who were weak enough to bow to them. And Richard would not bow. Clara, he said, his voice steady, we need to break the cycle completely. We have to make sure they can never rise again. We need to destroy every last piece of their power. Clara's gaze was filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. How Richard's eyes locked with hers. We go back to the source. The Watcher's power, their influence, isn't just in the ritual or the temple. It's in the belief they've seeded into the world. We have to destroy that the very idea of them. Clara nodded, understanding. We'll take the fight to them. All of them. Richard's pulse quickened. He knew what needed to be done. They had to sever the Watcher's influence at its core. The world was full of shadows, full of remnants. And as long as people believed in the power of the Watchers, their legacy would never die. But if they could destroy the belief itself, if they could erase the memory of the Watchers from humanity's collective mind, then, and only then, would they be free. Epilogue. The beginning of the end. The sky was heavy with dark clouds as Richard and Clara set out on their final journey, determined to end the Watcher's reign once and for all. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they also knew that this was the only path left to them. There was no turning back. And as they disappeared into the distance, the whispering faded into nothingness. The shadows that had followed Richard from the very beginning seemed to recede, their presence slowly but surely vanishing into the unknown. For the first time, Richard felt the weight of his ancestors' bloodline lift. But somewhere, deep in the shadows, the Watchers were still watching. And Richard knew they would be waiting for the next soul to rise. Chapter 16. The Last Echo, Section 1. The road to redemption. The journey to sever the last threads of the Watcher's influence took Richard and Clara across the world. Their mission was clear. Though daunting, they had to eradicate every trace of the Watchers, every last fragment of their power. And most importantly, destroy the very idea of them in the hearts and minds of those who had been touched by their malevolent whispers. The roads they traveled were not just physical. They were the paths of history, of belief, of influence. They knew that they couldn't fight the Watchers with mere force. The true battle was a battle of perception, a battle of belief itself. If they could erase the Watchers from the minds of humanity, if they could destroy the myths, the symbols, the rituals that kept them alive, then and only then could they be truly vanquished. Their first stop was an ancient monastery hidden deep in the Himalayas, where an order of monks had long since abandoned the world's gaze. It was said that the monks held a secret text, an ancient manuscript that contained the original accounts of the Watcher's first rise, and perhaps a way to erase the remnants of their power. "Do you think we'll find the answers here?" Clara asked as they stood before the monastery's massive stone gates, the wind howling around them. Richard looked up at the snow-covered peaks in the distance. "We have no choice. If there's one place that might still hold the knowledge we need, it's here." The monks welcomed them with quiet dignity, their faces calm and serene, but their eyes heavy with centuries of unspoken wisdom. The leader of the monastery, an elderly monk named Tenzin, greeted them with a calm smile that masked the gravity of what they had come to ask. "We have been waiting for you," Tenzin said, his voice soft, yet filled with ancient knowledge. "The Watchers have cast their shadows for too long. You come to us seeking the means to destroy their influence. But know this, it is not just knowledge you seek, it is freedom. And freedom comes at a price." Richard and Clara exchanged a glance. They had been prepared for the cost, but hearing it spoken aloud made it more real than ever. "What price?" Richard asked. "The price of forgetting," Tenzin replied. "The Watchers are tied to the fabric of human history. The only way to erase them is to erase the memory of them from the hearts of those who know their names, their stories, to break their hold. You must make humanity forget, not just the power, but the very belief in it. This will require the undoing of centuries of myth." Clara's eyes widened. "To make the world forget the Watchers." Tenzin nodded. "Yes, the rituals that bind them are woven into the stories people tell, the beliefs they hold dear. To undo this, you must gather the remnants of those stories and destroy them. The belief itself is what keeps them alive." Richard's mind raced. To break the cycle, they would have to confront every symbol, every legend, every whisper that had allowed the Watchers to exist in the first place. "We'll do whatever it takes," Richard said, his voice firm. Section 2. The first fragment. The journey to undo the Watchers' influence took them from one ancient site to another, forgotten temples, libraries hidden in the deepest recesses of the earth, and lost tombs that had not seen the light of day for centuries. At each location, they uncovered fragments of the Watchers' legacy stories, inscriptions, rituals that had been passed down through generations. At each site, they destroyed the remnants, burning the texts, shattering the symbols, and erasing every trace of the Watcher's influence from the world. But with each destruction, Richard and Clara felt a growing sense of unease. They were unraveling history itself, erasing the foundation of centuries-old beliefs. What if they were doing more harm than good? Do you ever wonder if we're making a mistake? Clara asked one evening as they sat beside a campfire, the night deep around them. What if by erasing the Watchers, we're also erasing the lessons of history? What if we forget how to fight darkness because we've destroyed the stories that taught us how? Richard thought for a long moment, staring into the fire. I used to believe that these stories held power, he said quietly. But I've learned that the Watchers were never the stories. They were the ones who used the stories to control people. We're not destroying history. We're freeing it. Clara nodded, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. I hope you're right. The days stretched on, and with each site they visited, Richard felt the weight of their mission growing heavier. There were moments when the whispers, the echoes of the Watchers returned, faint but persistent, trying to claw their way back into his mind. But every time, Richard pushed them away. He refused to let them reclaim him. They came to the final location, a remote island off the coast of Greece, where the last fragment of the Watcher's influence was believed to be hidden. An ancient temple, long abandoned, stood at the edge of the sea, its once great columns now broken and weathered by time. The last piece, Clara said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. This is it. Once we destroy this temple, the Watcher's influence will be gone for good. Richard nodded, though a nagging feeling still lingered. They had come so far. But now, standing before the ruins of the temple, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting. Some final test. Some final challenge. They entered the temple, the air thick with the weight of history. The walls were covered with the same symbols they had seen before. And in the center of the temple stood an altar, untouched by time. But as they approached, a deep rumble filled the air, and the ground beneath them shook. No, Richard whispered. It can't be. Not again. The altar began to glow with an eerie light, and from the shadows emerged the figures of the Watchers, or at least their final remnants. They were no longer human. They had become something else, something more primal, more dangerous. The whispers, louder than ever, filled Richard's mind, threatening to overwhelm him. But he fought against them, pushing through the darkness. This time, he would not let the Watchers win. Section 3. The Final Confrontation. The battle was unlike anything they had faced before. The temple trembled as the Watchers' remaining power surged through the air, warping the very fabric of reality around them. Richard and Clara fought with everything they had, their determination the only thing keeping them from being consumed. With each strike, Richard felt the power of the Watchers weakening. But just as it seemed they were winning, the leader of the Watchers emerged from the shadows, a towering figure of dark energy, its form flickering like smoke. You cannot destroy us, the figure said, its voice a deep, ancient growl. We are not bound by the physical realm. We are timeless. We have always been. Richard stepped forward, his hand gripping the relic that had been the key to their victory. No, you're wrong. You're not timeless. You're just a memory, and memories can be erased. With a final, forceful strike, Richard plunged the relic into the heart of the altar. The ground shook violently as the Watcher's power was consumed, the energy ripping through the temple in a flash of blinding light. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a final explosion of light, the temple collapsed, its remnants vanishing into the sea. Epilogue: A New Dawn. The world was silent once again. The Watchers were gone, their influence erased from the fabric of time itself. Richard and Clara stood on the shores of the island, the wreckage of the temple lying in ruins behind them. The sun was rising on a new day, its light breaking through the clouds that had loomed for so long. "It's over," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a quiet relief. Richard nodded, the weight of their journey finally lifting from his shoulders. The world was free. But as they looked out over the sea, Richard knew that the battle for the future was never truly finished. There would always be shadows. But for now, they had won. And as long as they stood, they would keep fighting. Chapter 17, The World Unseen, Section 1. The Return of Peace. The days following the destruction of the Watcher's Temple were oddly quiet. But the silence was different. This time it wasn't oppressive or unnerving. Instead, it was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed. The air cleared, and the world allowed to breathe again. Richard and Clara returned to Silvermere, but it wasn't the same. The town had changed. Or perhaps it was they who had changed. Richard felt lighter, as though the weight of generations had been lifted from his shoulders. But there was a lingering sense of unease. The Watchers were gone, their influence erased from the fabric of history. But Richard knew that the world was not as simple as it seemed. There were always shadows, always something lurking beneath the surface. As he stood by the window of his cottage, looking out over the town, Clara joined him. Her presence was steady, a quiet reassurance after the chaos they had endured. "Do you think it's really over?" Richard asked, his voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Clara glanced up at him, her gaze thoughtful. "I think it is. Richard, the Watchers are gone. Their influence, their grip on humanity, is no more. But as you've always said, darkness never truly disappears. It just waits for a chance to resurface." Richard nodded. It was a bitter truth, but it was one he had come to accept. The world would always have its challenges, its shadows, but that didn't mean it had to fall to them. They could fight back. They had fought back, and they had won. "Then we'll be ready," Richard said. His voice firm, Clara smiled, the weight of their shared journey finally giving way to a quiet sense of peace. Always. Section 2. The Echoes of Power. But despite their quiet victories, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play, something just beyond his reach. As much as they had destroyed the Watcher's grip on history, their legacy still lingered in the cracks of the world, in the hidden pockets of belief, in the whispered corners of forgotten places. He had done everything he could, but something inside him told him that the Watcher's story was not truly finished. Weeks passed, and life in Silvermere resumed a sense of normalcy. Yet Richard couldn't ignore the subtle shifts, the faint whispers that still clung to the town. The way the trees in the forest seemed to murmur when the wind blew, or the way the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. It was as though the Watchers had left behind a residue of power, one that hadn't fully dissipated. Then, one evening, Richard received a letter. It was sealed with an ancient wax emblem. He recognized immediately the same symbol that had once adorned the altar at End House. The letter was from an unknown sender, but its contents were chilling. The handwriting was uneven, as though it had been written in haste. "You think you have won, Richard Graham, but we are not finished. The Watchers are not bound by the rules of this world. The portal has closed, yes, but the seed has been planted. You have only scratched the surface. Beware the cracks in reality, for they are where we grow." Richard's blood ran cold as he read the final line. "We are waiting, and we always return." Section 3. The Hidden Fractures. Clara entered the room just as Richard set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. She saw the expression on his face and immediately stepped forward. "What's wrong?" He handed her the letter without a word. Clara read it, her brow furrowing with concern. This doesn't make sense. We closed the portal. We destroyed the Watcher's hold." Richard's voice was low, filled with a quiet urgency. "But they're not gone. This letter is a warning. It's like they've left something behind, something that wasn't destroyed." Clara's eyes darkened with realization. "The fractures, the ones you felt, they're real. Richard, the Watchers didn't just have power in one place. Their influence wasn't contained to a single temple or ritual. They had fragments spread across the world, linked to places of power, belief, and magic. And we've only begun to uncover them." Richard's gaze hardened. "Then we're not done yet. There are still cracks in reality. And if the Watchers can slip through them, then we need to find out where they are." Section 4. The Gathering Storm. The letter had shaken them both. While Richard and Clara had believed that their battle against the Watchers was over, it seemed that the entity was far more insidious, far more deeply embedded into the world than they had realized. Over the next few weeks, they began to gather information from those who had fought against the Watchers or had encountered their remnants. They uncovered strange anomalies in the world, places where the fabric of reality seemed to thin, where the influence of the Watchers had left its mark. It wasn't just a single temple or a forgotten ritual. The Watchers' power had spread, seeded into the corners of the world, waiting for the right moment to resurface. They also learned that the Watchers had never been just a force of destruction. They were patient, they were manipulators, and they had spread their influence into the minds of humanity, shaping belief, politics, and power for centuries. Richard and Clara decided to take the fight to the roots of the Watchers' power, not just confronting the remnants, but seeking out the places where their influence had taken hold. Every clue they uncovered led them deeper into the web the Watchers had woven, a web that extended far beyond Silvermere, far beyond the temple. They traveled to the hidden corners of the world, visiting remote sites where the Watchers had left their marks. In the Highlands of Scotland, deep in the jungles of South America, beneath the ruins of ancient cities, everywhere they went, the echoes of the Watchers' presence followed them. They found fragments of forgotten texts, ancient shrines, and symbols carved into stone. Each discovery brought them closer to the truth, but also deeper into the Watchers' web. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized the true scope of their fight. The Watchers were not just an ancient cult or a dark power. They were a part of the world's very foundation, an influence that stretched across time and space. The deeper they went, the more they saw the fracture lines in reality, places where the Watchers had left their mark. And Richard knew that their work was far from finished. The Watchers may have been defeated, but their remnants, their influence, were still very much alive. There were cracks in the world, and as long as those cracks remained, the Watchers would find a way to return. Section 5. The Final Choice. One night, as they sat in a quiet cabin they had rented in a remote village in the Swiss Alps, Richard turned to Clara, his face a mixture of weariness and resolve. "We've been chasing shadows," he said quietly, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "Everywhere we go, we find a piece of the Watchers, but it's never enough." They were right. "Clara, we've only scratched the surface." Clara was silent for a long moment, her eyes lost in thought. Then she turned to him, her voice steady. "What are you saying?" Richard met her gaze, his expression solemn. "I'm saying we need to do something more. We need to find the source of this power, the cracks. They're not just places where the Watcher's influence lingers. They're windows. And if we don't close them for good, then they'll keep coming back." Clara looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "What are you proposing?" Richard stood, his hands clenched at his sides. "We need to find the origin, the root of the Watcher's power. We need to go beyond the physical realm. We need to destroy the idea itself, the belief that fuels them. Only then can we truly end this." Clara's eyes filled with understanding. "You're talking about cutting off their power at its source. But to do that, we'd need to go beyond what we know. We'd need to confront whatever ancient force binds them." Richard nodded. "Exactly. The Watchers are not just beings from the past. They are ideas, primal forces that feed off belief and fear. To truly defeat them, we need to eradicate that power." Clara stood with him, her resolve matching his own. "Then let's do it, together." Epilogue. The Infinite War. The battle against the Watchers was far from over. Their power had been rooted in the very fabric of human history, and their influence had spread like a poison through the veins of time. Richard and Clara knew that to truly end the threat, they would need to venture into places unknown, to confront forces beyond their understanding. As they set out on the next stage of their journey, the horizon before them seemed endless, full of uncertainty. But they were not afraid. The shadows would always be there, waiting. But as long as they stood together, Richard and Clara would continue to fight to ensure that the Watchers would never rise again. For as long as the echoes of the past remained, there would always be a fight. Season, and they would be ready. Chapter 18. The Heart of Darkness. Section 1. Unraveling the Core. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Since leaving Silvermere behind, Richard and Clara had traveled through many landscapes, mountains, deserts, jungles, cities, and remote outposts. Each place held a fragment of the Watcher's dark influence. Each piece of the puzzle leading them further into the heart of a secret war that spanned across time and space. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized that they weren't just fighting against an ancient cult. They were fighting against something far older, a primal force that had shaped the very fabric of reality. Clara's research had begun to focus on a new direction. She had uncovered references to an artifact called the Heart of Darkness, an ancient relic said to hold the original power of the Watchers. It was rumored to be a source of unimaginable influence, the core from which the Watchers had drawn their ability to manipulate history, reality, and even the minds of men. The relic itself had been hidden away for centuries, but its power remained dormant, just waiting to be activated. This Heart of Darkness, Clara said one evening, poring over the ancient texts in their temporary refuge in an underground library beneath an old cathedral. It's not just an object. It's a focal point, a convergence of power. If we can find it, we can destroy it. Richard leaned over, studying the page she was reading. You're saying this artifact is where the Watcher's influence originated? Clara nodded. Exactly. If we destroy it, we can erase their presence from existence. It's not just about stopping their return. It's about eliminating the root of their power, the very essence of what they are. Richard felt a spark of hope. After everything they had been through, this could finally be the key to ending their nightmare once and for all. But there was something about the Heart of Darkness that unsettled him. The more he learned about it, the more he realized how deeply entwined it was with the Watcher's origins. It was both the source of their power and the foundation of their existence. To destroy it would mean confronting something ancient, something far beyond their understandings. Clara sensed his unease. I know it's daunting, but we don't have a choice. We need to find this heart before the Watchers do. If they're still pulling strings from the shadows, this is the last thing that could give them the power to return. Richard nodded, trying to suppress the growing fear. Where do we begin? Clara hesitated, her eyes darkened with a mix of determination and fear. The Heart of Darkness was hidden away long ago in a place called the Abyss of Ages, a labyrinth beneath the earth, older than any civilization we know. It's said to be located somewhere in the Middle East, the ruins of an ancient city, thought to be lost to time. Richard stood, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. Then we go there, we find it, and we destroy it. Section 2. The Abyss of Ages. The journey to the Abyss of Ages was treacherous, fraught with danger at every turn. As they arrived in the remote desert region where the ancient city was believed to lie, they found themselves in a vast expanse of sand, where the sun burned relentlessly and the horizon seemed endless. They trekked for days, guided by the maps and texts that Clara had painstakingly compiled. The ruins they sought were buried deep beneath the sand, hidden from the eyes of the modern world. But Clara's research had pinpointed a specific location, a series of underground tunnels that led to the Heart of Darkness itself. At the edge of the desert, they found a long-forgotten entrance, marked by weathered stone pillars half buried in the shifting sands. The air felt unnaturally still, and as they descended into the tunnels, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and polished, as though they had been carved by hands far beyond any civilization known to history. This place, It feels ancient, Richard murmured, his voice reverberating through the hollow corridors. Clara nodded. It's older than anything we've seen. This is where the Watchers began. This is where their power was forged. As they ventured deeper into the labyrinth, the tunnels grew narrower, and the air grew thick with dust. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to those they had seen in the Watchers' temples, but older, more primal. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the very earth was alive with dark energy, pressing down on them, trying to prevent them from going further. "This is it," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper as they reached the heart of the labyrinth. "The chamber is just ahead." They stepped into a vast, circular chamber, its walls covered in intricate carvings depicting the fight of the Watchers, their power, their influence, their hold over humanity. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. Atop it lay the heart of darkness, a pulsating black stone, surrounded by swirling shadows. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he gazed at the relic. The heart of darkness was more than just an artifact. It was a living thing, its power radiating outwards, its presence suffocating. "This is it," Richard said, his voice low with awe and dread. "This is the source of everything." Clara stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the stone. "We have to destroy it, now." But as she reached out to touch the stone, the chamber trembled, the walls shook, and the shadows began to twist and writhe around them. Richard's heart raced as the air thickened with dark energy. "No," Clara shouted. "We have to hurry." Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and from the darkness, figures began to emerge. They were the Watchers, or rather, their manifestations. Figures made of shadow and smoke, their glowing eyes filled with malevolent power. Richard felt the fear grip him like a vice. The Watchers were not gone. They had never truly left. They had been waiting for the heart of darkness to call them back. The figure in the center, the leader of the Watchers, stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of existence. Its voice was a low growl, echoing through the chamber. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "The heart of darkness is the essence of all things. It is the seed from which all life grows, the shadow that guides the world. You cannot erase it. It is part of you." Richard's heart pounded as he realized the truth. The Watchers weren't just an ancient cult. They were the embodiment of darkness itself, woven into the fabric of reality. Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. "We have to destroy it. This is our only chance." With every ounce of strength he had left, Richard charged forward, his hand gripping the relic. The moment his fingers touched it, a surge of power coursed through him, and the world around him exploded in a blinding light. Section 3. The final confrontation. For a moment, everything was nothing but light and pain. Richard felt himself torn apart, his body disintegrating under the weight of the force radiating from the heart of darkness. The Watchers' cries filled his mind, their voices trying to overwhelm him, to pull him into the abyss. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the light vanished. Richard was standing alone in the center of the chamber, the heart of darkness now shattered, its fragments scattered across the stone floor. The shadows had faded, and the oppressive weight of darkness had lifted from the air. Clara rushed to his side, her face pale with worry. "Richard, are you—" "I'm fine," Richard said, his voice weak, but filled with a sense of relief. "It's over." The Watchers were gone. Their power had been eradicated, the source of their existence destroyed. There was no more darkness to feed on, no more influence to wield. The world had been freed from their grasp. Clara looked at the fragments of the heart of darkness, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's gone. We've done it. We've finally destroyed them." Richard nodded, his heart still racing. "But at what cost? What did we just erase?" Clara didn't answer, but Richard knew that they had destroyed more than just the Watchers. They had erased the very essence of darkness that had existed throughout human history. And in doing so, they had also erased part of themselves, part of the story of the world. As they left the ruin behind and made their way back to the surface, Richard knew that their battle was over. But the scars of the journey would never truly fade. The world had been freed from the Watchers, but at a cost. And in the silence that followed, Richard realized that the true price of freedom was not just the fight against darkness, it was the loss of the shadows themselves. Epilogue. The final dawn. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a new light on the world. The war had ended. The Watcher's legacy destroyed. And yet, as Richard and Clara stood together, watching the dawn break over the landscape, they knew that the world was never truly free from the shadows. But for now, it was enough. For now, the Watchers were gone. Chapter 19. The Long Shadow Section 1. The Price of Freedom. The days following the destruction of the Heart of Darkness were strangely quiet. The Watchers, whose presence had once tainted the world, were no more. Yet the weight of their absence lingered, pressing down on Richard and Clara like a heavy fog. The silence felt unnatural. The peace they had fought for, won at such a steep price, seemed fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. The ruins of the desert lay far behind them now, a distant memory buried beneath the sands. They had returned to Silvermere, but something had changed. They were not the same people who had first arrived here, driven by fear and uncertainty. Their battle had left deep scars, not just on the world, but on themselves. Richard stood by the window of their small cottage in Silvermere, watching the soft light of dawn break through the trees. The town seemed peaceful. The life that had once been quiet now settling into an almost eerie calm. He could almost believe that everything was normal, that their fight had been nothing more than a distant nightmare. But deep inside, something nagged at him. The weight of the Watcher's legacy had not disappeared with their defeat. The world felt empty. And in that emptiness, there was a hunger, a craving for power, for control. It was a hunger that had never truly gone away. And Richard realized, with a deep sense of foreboding, that it would take more than the destruction of the Watchers to end this battle. "Clara," Richard called softly, turning away from the window. His heart was heavy, and the silence between them felt like an ocean. Clara emerged from the next room, her face pale but resolute. She had been quiet lately, her mind seemingly lost in the storm of what they had endured. She had always been the calm presence by his side, but even she was not immune to the scars of their journey. "I've been thinking," Richard began, his voice uncertain, "about what we've done. I know we destroyed the Watchers. I know we ended their hold on the world, but it doesn't feel like the battle is over. Something still lingers. Clara, something darker than we understand." Clara looked at him with a knowing gaze, her eyes reflecting the same concern. "I've been feeling it too. The Watchers may be gone, but their influence, their grip on humanity, it's not just in their physical power. It's in the hearts of those who believed, the people who worshipped them, who clung to their promises of control." Richard sighed, the weight of the truth settling deep in his chest. "We fought so hard to break their chains, but the chains were never just about one group. It was about the hunger for power, the need for someone to lead, to control." Clara walked toward him, her fingers brushing his arm in a quiet gesture of support. The Watchers were just a manifestation of that desire, a shadow. But the shadow always returns when the light fades. Richard turned toward her, his mind racing with the consequences of their victory. "Then what do we do now?" Clara's gaze was unwavering. "We stop the cycle. Richard, we prevent the shadows from taking hold again. We can't fight the Watchers because they were never just a group. They were a part of the darkness that lives in every person, the desire for control, for dominance. It's in all of us." Section 2. The Reigniting Flame. Days turned into weeks, and as time passed, Richard and Clara realized the battle they had won was not the last. The world was free, but the human heart was not so easily freed from the shadows of the past. Richard began to understand the truth. The Watchers weren't an external enemy. They were a reflection of humanity's darker impulses. The battle wasn't just against them. It was against the forces that had given rise to them. And those forces had not been eradicated by a simple destruction of power. They had been woven into the fabric of the world, into the collective consciousness of humanity. The shadows that had once served the Watchers were still alive, still waiting for someone to awaken them. And with the Watchers gone, the desire for control, for power, was once again free to take root. Richard's thoughts were interrupted when Clara approached him one evening with a stack of ancient texts. She had been working tirelessly in the study, piecing together the remnants of their journey, trying to uncover any final clues that might reveal how they could stop this cycle for good. "I've been going over the texts again," Clara said, her voice quiet but intense. "There's something we missed, something we need to understand." Richard joined her at the table. His curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Clara pointed to an inscription in one of the texts, a passage they had overlooked in their earlier research. It says that the Watchers were not the only ones who sought to control the fabric of reality. There are others who've attempted the same secret societies, hidden orders. People throughout history have tried to unlock the power of the Watchers, believing that they could harness it. Richard leaned forward, his mind racing. "So, we're not the only ones who know about this power." "No," Clara said. "The Watchers weren't the first. There were others who sought their influence long before them. And the true power doesn't lie with the Watchers alone. It's the power of belief itself. Whoever controls belief controls the world." Richard's stomach tightened with the realization. "You're saying the Watchers were just one piece of a much larger puzzle." Clara nodded grimly. Yes. And if we want to stop this, we need to understand who else is involved. We need to stop the forces that are trying to take the Watcher's place. Section 3. The Gathering Dark. As the truth began to unfold, Richard and Clara knew they had one final choice to make. Would they continue their fight against the remnants of the Watcher's power? Or would they seek out those who had been pulling the strings from the shadows? The more they uncovered, the more they realized that they were not alone in this struggle. There were other factions, hidden societies that had always been a part of the world's unseen history. They had been waiting for the moment when the Watcher's influence would fade, so they could seize the power for themselves. One of these factions, known as the Eclipsed Order, was rumored to have been a part of the Watcher's rise in ancient times. They had kept their presence hidden, operating in the background, manipulating events to suit their purposes. Now that the Watchers were gone, the Eclipsed Order would likely try to fill the void. "We can't stop now, Richard," Clara said one night, her voice firm with resolve. "The Watchers may have been defeated, but we're only seeing the beginning of what's to come. The Eclipsed Order is still out there, and they're not the only ones. If we don't stop them, they'll take what the Watchers left behind and use it for their own purposes." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we find them. We stop them before they can fill the gap." But Clara's eyes were troubled. "It won't be that simple. These people are powerful. They have been manipulating events for centuries. We may not be able to stop them all at once, but we have to try." Richard took her hand, his determination as fierce as ever. "We've already fought the darkest of shadows, Clara, and we'll keep fighting together." Section 4. The Endless Fight with Renewed Purpose. Richard and Clara set out on the next phase of their journey, knowing that the world was not yet free from the influence of darkness. The Watchers had been one chapter, but the story was far from over. The power they had tried to control, the hunger for domination, for influence over reality itself, would always be present. But Richard and Clara would not back down. They had faced the Watchers and survived, and now they would fight the next shadow in their way. The road ahead would be long, and the forces they faced would be even more dangerous than what had come before. But they would be ready. The battle for the world's soul was not just about fighting what they could see. It was about confronting the unseen, the whispering forces that thrived on fear and belief. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard and Clara knew that the battle for the future was far from over, but they would fight until the end. Epilogue. The dawn of an eternal struggle. As Richard and Clara prepared for their next steps, the world was, for the moment, still. But in the quiet places, in the cracks of reality that still held the Watcher's influence, something stirred, and in the distance, the shadows waited, always patient, always watching. For the true war had only just begun. Chapter 20. The Flame of Rebirth, Section 1. The Shadow's Call. The days following their decision to confront the Eclipsed Order were filled with urgency. Richard and Clara knew that the power they had just defeated was not the only darkness in the world. The Watchers were but one manifestation of an ancient and far-reaching influence, a hunger for control that had lasted millennia. But the Eclipsed Order was different. It wasn't just an ancient cult. It was a force woven into the very fabric of human civilization, a secret society that had survived, hidden in the shadows of history. its members intertwined with the world's most powerful institutions, and their ultimate goal, to control the very narrative of reality itself. Richard's mind raced with the weight of their new mission. The Watchers had sought to control belief and fear. The Eclipsed Order had perfected it. They had waited for centuries, observing from the darkness. And now that the Watchers' influence had faded, they were ready to step into the void. "We can't underestimate them," Clara said. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the information they had gathered. This isn't like fighting the Watchers. They've been planning this for centuries. They've been feeding off the world's power in ways we can't even begin to understand. Richard nodded. They had learned that the Eclipsed Order had been part of humanity's darkest moments, influencing wars, revolutions, and even entire civilizations, always from the shadows. They had used the Watchers as pawns, their true goal being something far more profound to shape history itself. Clara slammed the notebook shut, her voice resolute. "We need to find their stronghold. We need to know where they operate from. Their power is global. Richard, it's not enough to stop one or two individuals. We have to break them at their core." Richard's expression hardened. "Then let's find them." Section 2. The Trail of Shadows. The search for the Eclipsed Order took Richard and Clara deep into the heart of the world's hidden places, following cryptic clues, hidden messages, and long-forgotten symbols that had been scattered throughout history. But every lead they uncovered seemed to be nothing more than a shadow of the true nature of the Order. They traveled to forgotten archives, secret vaults, hidden beneath ancient libraries, and even remote locations where only a few knew of the Order's true influence. The deeper they delved, the more the world around them seemed to shift. The very nature of reality felt fragile, as though the threads of history were being manipulated behind the scenes, twisting and pulling them in ways they couldn't see. Each discovery was like a key unlocking a new level of understanding. But it was clear that they were always one step behind. The Eclipsed Order was a ghost, slipping through the cracks of history, its true motives veiled in layers of secrecy. In a remote monastery in Eastern Europe, Clara found something that would change everything. A text, older than any they had seen before, inscribed with symbols that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. It spoke of something called the Flame of Rebirth, a powerful force that could reshape reality itself. Clara translated the text carefully, her face pale with shock as the full meaning of the words began to sink in. The Flame of Rebirth is not just a symbol, Clara murmured, her voice filled with awe. It's a real force, one that can rewrite the rules of existence itself. And the Eclipsed Order has been trying to harness it for centuries. Richard stepped closer, his brow furrowing in confusion. So, the Order isn't just about controlling history. They're trying to control reality itself. Yes, Clara said, looking up from the text. And if they succeed, they could change everything. They could reshape the world in their image, bending reality to their will. The Watchers were just a stepping stone in their plan. The real power lies in the flame. Richard's heart sank as the implications settled in. If the Order succeeded in controlling the flame, they would have the power to alter not just events, but the very fabric of the world. It was a force beyond anything they had faced, and it was now their mission to stop it before it was too late. Section 3. The Heart of the Eclipsed Order. The trail eventually led them to a hidden fortress in the mountains of Tibet, where the Eclipsed Order had been rumored to have its central stronghold. The fortress was old, built into the side of a mountain, its stone walls carved from the very earth itself. It was a place that seemed to exist outside of time, a place where reality itself felt malleable. As Richard and Clara approached the fortress, the air grew thick with an almost tangible energy, and the shadows around them seemed to warp and twist. It felt as though they were walking into the very heart of the darkness, a place where the lines between past, present, and future blurred. The gates to the fortress stood open, as if expecting them. The moment they stepped inside, the world seemed to shift, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. It was the sound of something ancient awakening, something that had been dormant for far too long. Inside the fortress, the walls were lined with ancient symbols, each one more intricate and elaborate than the last. It was clear that this place was more than just a stronghold, it was a temple, dedicated to the flame of rebirth. The very structure seemed to pulse with energy, its heart beating in time with the hum that resonated through the air. At the center of the fortress stood a massive stone altar, its surface glowing with an eerie light. Surrounding the altar were cloaked figures, chanting in a language that Richard could feel in his bones. The air was thick with power, and the presence of the Eclipsed Order was undeniable. They had been waiting for this moment, and now Richard and Clara had arrived. "This is it," Clara said, her voice tight with fear and determination. "The flame of rebirth. If we don't stop them here, we won't have a world left to save." Richard stepped forward, his eyes locked on the altar. The power in the room was overwhelming, and he could feel it tugging at him, pulling him toward the flame. But he didn't move. He had to stay focused. They had to stop the order, no matter the cost. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, its hood falling back to reveal the face of the leader of the Eclipsed Order. It was the same woman who had warned them back in Silvermere, the one who had promised that they would never be free. "You should not have come," she said, her voice low and menacing. "The flame of rebirth is the ultimate power. And you, Richard Graham, were always meant to be part of it." Richard's blood ran cold. "You were using me all along." The woman's smile was cold and knowing. "Not just you. You were the last piece of the puzzle. Your bloodline was always meant to be the key to our power." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "You'll never control it. We will stop you." The woman's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You think you can stop us? You think you can destroy the flame?" Richard stepped closer, his fists clenched. "We'll destroy everything you've built. You're nothing." The woman's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You don't understand. The flame of rebirth will reshape the world. Nothing can stop it. Not even you." The power in the room surged, and Richard felt the weight of it pressing down on him. This was their final confrontation. If they didn't stop the order now, it would be the end of everything. Clara turned to Richard, her eyes meeting his. "Are you ready?" Richard nodded, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "I'm ready. Let's end this." Together, they raised their hands, channeling all the strength they had left. The air crackled with energy as they focused their will on the altar, on the flame. It was time to destroy it, in the order once and for all. Section 4. The Last Stand. The room exploded with blinding light. The flame of rebirth flickered, its energy swirling out of control as Richard and Clara focused their combined power on it. The Eclipsed Order's leader screamed, her hands raised in an attempt to harness the power for herself. But it was too late. The flame was no longer under her control. With a final, deafening roar, the flame collapsed in on itself, and the entire fortress shook. The walls cracked, and the energy that had once pulsed through the stone began to fade, leaving only silence in its wake. The Eclipsed Order was no more. The flame of rebirth had been extinguished, its power erased. Richard and Clara stood in the ruins of the fortress, their bodies shaking with the exertion of the battle. They had done it. The world had been saved for now, but as the dust settled and the echoes of their struggle faded into silence, Richard knew that the shadows would always return, and they would be ready. Epilogue. The Legacy of the Watchers. With the destruction of the Eclipsed Order and the eradication of the flame of rebirth, the world had been freed from the darkness that had lingered for so long. The Watchers were gone, and their legacy was but a shadow of history. But Richard and Clara knew that the fight against the shadows was never truly over. There would always be those who sought to manipulate reality, to control the world through fear and belief. And as long as those forces existed, Richard and Clara would stand against them. Together, they would keep the darkness at bay, and they would never stop fighting. Chapter 21. The Return of the Shadows. Section 1. A fragile peace. The world outside had returned to a fragile peace. The storm of centuries-old darkness had passed, but the cost of their victory weighed heavily on Richard and Clara. With the Eclipsed Order dismantled and the flame of rebirth extinguished, the immediate danger had passed. But something lingered. The world was quieter now, but the silence felt unsettling. The echoes of the Watchers' influence, their manipulation, still reverberated in every corner of human history. Richard sat in their cottage, staring out at the quiet streets of Silvermere. For the first time in years, the town felt calm, serene even. The air was clearer, the shadows less threatening. Yet, there was a deep unease in Richard's chest, a feeling that something was missing. Clara walked in, her presence soothing yet resolute. She had been busy, still poring over the remnants of their research, trying to understand what had happened. They had traveled the world, fought against powerful forces, and seen things no one should ever have to witness. But there was one question that lingered. Was it truly over? "Richard," Clara said, her voice calm but serious. "I've been looking at the texts we found in the Eclipsed Order's vaults. Some of them are strange. They speak of a final phase, something they had planned, something that wasn't just about the Watchers." Richard looked up at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Clara sat down beside him. The text in her hands opened to an ancient page covered with cryptic symbols. These symbols, they're linked to an ancient prophecy. It's not just about control, Richard, it's about a convergence, a merging of timelines, a new world. Richard's pulse quickened. A new world. What are you talking about? Clara's eyes darkened with the gravity of her words. The eclipsed order didn't just want to control belief or shape history. They wanted to reshape reality itself. They wanted to tear down the fabric of time. The Watchers were only one piece of the puzzle. The prophecy speaks of an event where the barriers between worlds, between timelines, break down. And it says that when the final phase begins, nothing can stop it. Section 2. The Convergence. As Clara explained the ancient prophecy, Richard's mind raced. What she was describing was not just an event of power, it was an apocalyptic shift. The eclipsed order had not only been after the flame of rebirth to reshape the world, but to fuse different realities into one, creating a chaotic world where their power would be absolute. It's not just a weapon they wanted to control. Clara continued, her voice thick with fear. It's the entire structure of reality, the balance of time itself. If the convergence happens, everything we know, everything we are, will collapse into a new form, where the Watcher's influence and the eclipsed order's plans will be supreme. We would be trapped in a world reshaped by their will. Richard felt the weight of her words sink in. If this prophecy was true, then they hadn't truly defeated the Watchers or the eclipsed order. They had only delayed it. The final phase had begun. And this time, it wasn't just about fighting against an enemy. It was about surviving the unraveling of everything they had ever known. Where does the prophecy say this will happen? Richard asked, his voice urgent. Clara scanned the page, her finger tracing the symbols. It doesn't say exactly, but there are clues, locations, places where time is already beginning to fray. They are spots in the world where the veil between dimensions is thinnest. And those places, Richard, are beginning to destabilize. Richard stood up, his mind racing. Then we need to stop this now. We can't let the convergence happen. We need to find these places, and we need to seal them. Clara nodded, already flipping through the pages. We've already been to some of them. The desert ruins, the monastery. But there are others. Ancient sites scattered across the world, each one tied to a part of the prophecy. We'll need to move fast. Section 3. Fractures in Time. The search took them across the world once more. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. They moved quickly, urgently, following the trail of ancient sites linked to the eclipsed order's plans. From the dense jungles of Southeast Asia to forgotten ruins in the heart of Africa, the world seemed to hold its breath as Richard and Clara fought against the rising tide of instability. In the deep caverns beneath Ikai, Egypt, they uncovered another site, a massive chamber hidden beneath the Great Pyramid. The air was thick with an unnatural energy, and the walls were etched with the same symbols they had seen in the eclipsed order's vaults. Clara's eyes widened as she deciphered the ancient language. This is it, the heart of time, the place where all the timelines converge. Richard's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean? Clara looked up, her face pale. The heart of time is where the past, present, and future are bound. If the eclipsed order can control it, they can manipulate time itself. They could rewrite history, change the future, erase the present. All of it would be under their control. Richard felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, and the walls around them began to crack, as if the very fabric of time was shifting. We need to stop them. We need to destroy this place before it's too late. They moved quickly, but the deeper they went into the heart of the pyramid, the stronger the energy became. It felt as though they were walking into the core of the world's power, where every moment in time converged. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, inscribed with the same fractal symbols, the key to unlocking the convergence. "We need to destroy the altar," Richard said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's the heart of the prophecy." Clara nodded, her hand shaking as she held the relic, the only weapon that could sever the connection between the worlds. We have to sever the connection. If we don't, the convergence will happen. And the Watchers, the eclipsed order, everything we fought against will become a reality. With one final, decisive strike, Clara plunged the relic into the center of the altar. A flash of blinding light erupted from the stone, and the entire chamber trembled as the walls cracked and the energy in the room reached a peak. Richard and Clara shielded themselves from the explosion of light, their bodies pushed back by the force. The light slowly faded, and as it did, the chamber began to crumble. The cracks in reality, the fractures in time, began to seal themselves. They had done it. The convergence had been stopped. But at what cost? Section 4. The final choice. As the dust settled, Richard and Clara stood in the ruins of the chamber. The remains of the altar crumbled to pieces. The world outside was quiet, but there was a lingering tension in the air. Richard could feel it, the weight of what they had just averted. "We did it," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "The convergence. It's over." But Richard's heart was heavy. The world might have been saved, but the cost was greater than he had imagined. They had destroyed the heart of time. But that act had severed more than just the Watcher's power. It had fractured the very fabric of history itself. The past, present, and future had been bound together in a delicate dance. And by destroying the altar, they had created an irreversible shift. "We stopped the Watchers," Richard said, his voice solemn. "But the balance, it's gone. The world will never be the same." Clara stepped closer, her eyes filled with understanding. "We couldn't let them win. Not like this. We've given humanity a chance to rebuild, to find its own path." Richard nodded, but the weight of the world's uncertain future pressed heavily on his chest. "And now, we live with the consequences." As they left the ruins behind, the world around them seemed to shift, as though reality itself was reeling from the changes they had set in motion. They had stopped the convergence, but the price of their victory would echo through time. And though the shadows of the Watchers had been erased, Richard knew that the true battle had only just begun. Epilogue. A new dawn. As Richard and Clara walked away from the ruins, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The world was still, the air fresh and clear. They had stopped the Watchers. They had stopped the convergence. But the future, uncertain as it was theirs to shape. Together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt hope. The journey was not over, but it had just begun.